Good morning. Good morning. We'll go ahead and get started. So we gave you a little bit more time this morning because I know we had a full day yesterday, and for those that were here, thank you for staying. We were very happy with the fact that of course we had a very large group in the morning, but that so many of you stayed throughout the sessions, and we had really good dialogue. And I hope that you've found it to be fulfilling and have made some new connections and been inspired by some new ideas. So, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, and honored guests, welcome to the second and final day of the Sustaining the Oasis conference. Now, before we get started today, I do want to make sure that I acknowledge a few people that were really key to making this conference happen and having it run smoothly. So, Maha Uraidi, Noor Al-Ghambarji, Luciana Gamara Moreira, you've been an amazing team to work with, and you've done everything in the background, so I just really appreciate, and many, many others, really appreciate all of the work that you've done. And I also want to acknowledge that you've been great thought partners in putting the conference together. And that's a testament to, I truly believe this, that you don't necessarily have to be an expert in a particular area to be able to provide guidance and to help actually bring ideas together. And then I also want to, of course, acknowledge the team that worked with me on the conference organizing team, the other thought leaders, Dr. Jamie Olson, Dr. Marcus King, and Dr. Mark Giordano. Thank you for the many weeks and hours of dialogue and figuring things out. And of course, Dean Mara and Dean Masri for giving us this space to organize around water and for recognizing the importance of this topic in particular, and for your leadership in building an environment program to complement the strengths that Georgetown has in other areas. And with that, of course, this is a collaboration. This has been a collaboration between two of our Georgetown campuses, one in Doha at GUQ and one in DC, Earth Commons, but actually Earth Commons plus. We've had engagement from a lot of different parts of Georgetown main campus. And to that end, we also have 20 students from across Georgetown that have been part of this program. They were competitively selected from the main campus in DC and from Georgetown University in Qatar. So if I could get the students that are at least in the room right now to stand up in recognition. And they've been part of every single session. They are taking notes for us, and as was mentioned, we really want to focus on having real tangible outcomes and in sharing the dialogues and things that will be coming out of these 2 days. And there are also going to be a select number of them will be doing a special performance in the afternoon, so hopefully you can stay for that as well. Okay, now a very brief recap. Really, I was so happy and so impressed with the quality of the discussions and all of the panels. And I think the people that we have brought together, I was just told actually that it brought up new ideas, brought up new ways of thinking, and that there's no better way of, no better outcome for any kind of conference than that. So yesterday, Malcolm Gladwell set the stage for us by inspiring this group to take social risks and face the grand environmental challenges that our societies are facing with urgency. Climate change is one of the biggest non-ordinary problems of our time. And it has and will continue to have profound implications for water security in the region and really everywhere in the world. But I also strongly believe that when humanity faces these grand challenges, we find ways to come together and collaborate across the commons. And when it comes to water, what we are facing is a non-linear problem, as Malcolm put it. The water defenses and management systems that we designed 50 or even 20 years ago are quickly becoming overwhelmed and in some cases obsolete. So today, the focus of the conference will be on the interconnected issues around water, those around climate change, nature-based solutions, food security, urbanization. With COP28 just 2 weeks away, this is an incredibly timely dialogue. And as it was mentioned yesterday, among the other planned outcomes, the high-level findings from this conference will be shared with the COP28 presidency team in support of water-related efforts. And now, to help us kick off the day, I would like to invite His Excellency Ambassador Ferdinand Lahnstein. Ambassador Lahnstein is the ambassador of the Kingdom of the Netherlands to Qatar. And this is very important because the Netherlands has played a pivotal role in advancing the role of water on the global stage and in advocating for greater integration of water into the climate agenda. They serve as one of 2 water champions for the COP28 presidency, along with the Republic of Tajikistan. And on a personal note, I've spent time in the Netherlands studying water management, flood management, at the Delft University of Technology. And it was really a profound experience to learn about water management in a country that takes it so seriously and that embeds it across the governance, across the consciousness, and really everybody is aware of the risks around water. So with that, Ambassador, I invite you to please come up and share a few remarks on behalf of the Netherlands.
Good morning, everybody. Assalamu alaikum. Very nice to be here. Thank you for your warm words, Raha. And always a pleasure to learn that you have had a great time in the Netherlands. That's what we like to hear. Honorable and distinguished guests, thank you, Georgetown University, for giving me the opportunity to make some opening remarks. And I hope I will not be too harsh on you in this early morning. And I feel very honored to be part of this Hirawat, this dialogue on the future of water security in the Gulf. In my speech, I will try to give you the Dutch perspective of how we want to encounter the challenges we face due to climate change. Of course, the context of the Netherlands is totally different from the Gulf region, but perhaps there are some interesting points to take into account. And in order to do so, I need you to tell a little bit about the country, my country, in relation to water. The Netherlands is for a large part basically a delta area of 2 large rivers. And the largest river, the Rhine, starts all the way back in Switzerland. And other parts of the Netherlands were created by reclaiming large parts from the sea. And roughly 26% of the landmass of the Netherlands is below sea level, and almost 60% of the landmass is sensitive to flooding. And to protect urban, industrial and agricultural areas, we have created almost 18,000 kilometers of dikes to resist the water. And once every 2 years, these dikes are being tested for the effects of climate change. And based on the latest inspection, more than 50% of the Dutch dikes are not meeting the safety standards for the year 2050. And in order to reach those safety standards, we will need between 15 and 30 billion euros to bring the infrastructure of the existing network of the dikes up to standard. The latest climate change scenarios of the Royal Netherlands Institute of Meteorology show that the speed of sea level rise is highly uncertain and highly unpredictable. And as Malcolm Gladwell was putting it yesterday, we are facing a non-linear problem in time. It makes a huge difference how much greenhouse gases are emitted globally and/or to what extent the melting of the ice caps of Antarctica will accelerate. And at this moment, we basically don't have a clue what and where the tipping point will be. In some scenarios, our North Sea could rise this century 1 to 2 meters. And around the year 2150, about 3 to 5 meters. If, and this is a big if the global emittance of greenhouse gases will sharply decline, the process of rising sea levels might slow down. And ladies and gentlemen, the good news is that technically we will be able to protect the Netherlands against sea level rise of approximately 3 meters with the current methodology of even higher and stronger dikes. But the flip side of this is that we are reaching the limits with our proven technology. And to give you a few examples, more than 2,000 kilometers of dikes need to be strengthened for each meter of sea rise level alone. And higher dikes need sometimes to be more broader, sometimes up to 90 meters, which might clash with our existing spatial infrastructure. And the amount of extractable sand from the North Sea will become a limiting factor, since we need 4 times more sand to strengthen our dikes in the near future. The real bad news is that with even higher dikes, we will face other water problems. For instance, the water flow from high to low from larger rivers might become far more difficult. And pumping out rainfall water will also become an issue. Huge pumping stations are needed to pump the water out of the rivers and the land to the sea. Intensifying pumping will bring saline groundwater to the surface, which in itself might lead to a shortage of fresh water and will have effect on our agriculture. And the impact of a relatively scarce nature landscape will be dramatic. Up to now, we are still trying to tackle the problem from a technical angle. Since 25% of the Dutch population lives under sea level, and our main economic centers are based on the sea level, it's difficult to make a paradigm shift. But we need to think out of our comfort zones. For instance, by relocating our main economic and urban centers to higher ground, and reusing the available areas for restoring and protecting natural freshwater stocks to save water for dry periods and reducing the impact of floods. Our time is slowly but surely running out, and we need to start making some fundamental choices. To adapt to climate change, water and soil need to guide us and to be in the center of our spatial planning and how we develop our economy. Ladies and gentlemen, although the context of the Netherlands is very different from the Gulf region, it's evident that we share the same challenge, that climate adaptation is beyond a technical challenge, and that we have to think out of the box and take social risks in order to successfully adapt. And therefore, today I'm also very happy that our former water envoy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, Henk Ovink, is here today. And I'm sure that he will share his knowledge and experience and insights with us on this important topic. Thank you for your attention. I wish you a fruitful and great day, and hopefully a lot of interesting solutions come to the table today. Shukran jazilan.
Musical chairs. All right, we're all here. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to the second day. Is my mic working? Yeah. Can everyone hear me? For those not here yesterday, my name is Natasha Hall. I'm a senior fellow with the Center for Strategic International Studies, where I lead the program on water and the future of the Middle East. I'm really pleased to be hosting this panel with such excellent speakers today. Today we're going to discuss how international climate negotiations, and particularly COP28, can apply to the unique socioeconomic and ecological realities in the Gulf, and how they can better foster water security more broadly. And we're going to try, within an hour, to identify actionable strategies to bridge the gap between global climate goals and regional water needs. And we hope to have everything solved in about an hour's time. So, without further ado, let me have provide some opening comments on this. The link between global climate goals and regional water needs seems to be quite logical to me, especially as climate adaptation plays a much larger role at the COP, which seems to be appropriate given it's been in the Middle East for 2 years running now. As one hydrologist once put it to me, if climate change is the shark, water is the teeth. And yet 71% of international climate finance to the MENA region from 2003 to 2021 went to climate mitigation, and less than 15 of that went to water and sanitation projects. Now, the Gulf will be particularly integral to both the mitigation and the adaptation piece. As energy producers, they may be the last to transition. And even if oil-rich Gulf countries are able to withstand much of the effects of climate change, they may be affected by their neighbors' water insecurity and higher temperatures. We know that at least one recent report has predicted that at the end of this century, areas of the Arabian Gulf could be hit by waves of heat and humidity so severe that simply being outside for a few hours could threaten human life. So we know that water adaptation mitigation is deeply interconnected. But we've seen rising international tensions between the mitigation and the adaptation piece. The developed world has sort of traditionally pushed for mitigation, and the developing world dealing with the effects of climate change disproportionately pushing more for adaptation. And also, water has not traditionally really been a part of COP negotiations. And yet they're very interconnected. A lack of a more resilient and adaptive agricultural practices are leaving farmlands fallow and potentially exacerbating climate change and displacing millions. Failure to effectively treat waste and wastewater sends thousands of people to hospitals, reduces the potential for treated wastewater to replace very precious groundwater. And it adds to methane emissions, which are 80 times more potent at warming than carbon dioxide. So I wanted to sort of have an icebreaker question for each of you to answer as you wish. how can COP sort of build this bridge between these real everyday concerns, of which water is a huge component, obviously, and this sort of amorphous climate change that it's been difficult to really, I think, break ground, especially in the global south? And how can water be part of that focus moving forward? And we'll start with Mr. Henk Ovink, who was appointed in 2015 by the Dutch cabinet as the first ever special envoy for international water affairs. In this capacity, he co-led the UN 2023 Water Conference, the second ever and first since 1977, bringing the world together in New York. As the ambassador for water, he was responsible for advocating water awareness around the world, building institutional capacity and coalitions amongst governments and multilateral organizations, the private sector and NGOs, and initiating innovative approaches like water as leverage to address the world's stressing needs on water. So I can't imagine a better person to answer such a question.
Thanks so much, Natasha, and it's great to be here. And thanks Georgetown University and its partners for having me. Inspiring. Very necessary question also in the lead up to the COP. As you rightly addressed, water has been absent from the negotiations. While it's key for both mitigation, not only because of the emissions, but also if we look at how we actually treat our fresh water. Fresh water is in our grounds, in our aquifers. Fresh water is in our rivers and our lakes. Fresh water is stored in our glaciers and in our poles. And that fresh water is diminishing at a rate we haven't seen before. We see a water crisis looming where freshwater availability is only going down every day, while freshwater demand is only going up with inefficient industries, agriculture, and energy sector. So we have no clue about how to deal with that scarcity of water, and at the same time, because of deforestation, bad planning, increased climate change, or pollution, we see more green water, water evaporation, being transported across continents, so not nations. So water, as a groundwater being transboundary, as rivers being transboundary, now is continental, is a global issue. Tapping into and driving climate change. On top of that, those emissions, wastewater treatment plants around the world, which we don't have enough of, emit more than all the shipping industry in the world. So a big force in climate change, and at the same time for adaptation, it's key. Over 90% of adaptation measures are nothing without water resiliency. So water plays a critical role, but not in the negotiations for many reasons. It's not a commodity, it's a human right. There is no compact or treaty around it, so there is no negotiation possible. Also the challenge leading up to the conference. And at the same time, it brings the solutions. It's the solution space. And this is the link to the COP. As we see emerging that the negotiations are more and more complex, we focus on the solutions. And this COP will definitely focus on those solutions too. But what do we do? If these are small-scale one-offs, they will never change the world. So figuring out what the bridge is between the negotiations and positioning water into that climate agenda as the way to deal with both mitigation and adaptation in policy, practice, governance, and finance, and at the same time showcase that water at scale for mitigation and adaptation help us to change course. We saw it in Glasgow, where these two perspectives of the negotiation and the solution space defined the agenda. Last year in Sharm el-Sheikh was more complex because the loss and damage and the 100 billion overtook the 2 weeks of being in Sharm el-Sheikh. But this year again at the UAE, the two sides of the coin of the COP, the negotiations and the solution will play a critical role. And in that solution space, water in its interlinkages with food security, energy security, biodiversity, and anything else will play a key role in showing that if we want to change course in the context of climate change, water is your best driver and best bet to invest in.
Thank you. I like that as water is sort of the solution space at this COP. And we'll talk a lot more, hopefully, about the water, energy, food nexus as well. Dr. Raha Hakim Devar probably doesn't need any introduction at this point, but I am going to introduce her because I think she's going to lend some really interesting insight from a scientist's perspective. Raha is a hydrologist and senior advisor to the Dean of Georgetown University's Earth Commons and the Dean of Georgetown University in Qatar in the areas of climate, environment, and innovation. She's also an adjunct professor at the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and non-resident fellow at the Middle East Institute Climate and Water Program, which, by the way, Hamid Mahmoud at the very end is the director of. She is former director of space sciences at Ball Aerospace, held civil servant appointments at NASA and the US Department of Agriculture, and was a technical consultant for UN Environment and the World Bank. So can you speak a bit to sort of this mitigation adaptation component and sort of how water fits into both?
I can, and I actually want to pull it back for a moment.
Yeah.
And I want to give a very honest answer to kind of the question that you posed earlier. There's a lot of skepticism among the science community with these processes like the COP. A lot of scientists and engineers, I started out as an engineer, I went on to do science in hydrology. And I think until more recently, we haven't had enough scientists, not just those at the high levels, for example, through the IPCC, but we haven't had enough engagement and involvement, true involvement, at things like the climate COP. And conversely, we haven't had enough technologists and solution providers. I actually love, Henk, when you said that water is the solution space. But as we've been discussing throughout this conference, that means finance, that means data, that means technology, right? It means innovation in public-private partnerships. It means a lot of things, and it means science. Scientifically robust decision-making should absolutely be part of things like the COP. And I think, I've been very happy to see more involvement and engagement by the science community, by the private sector, by a lot of people that are working on the water from both an adaptation and a mitigation perspective. One, being actively involved in the COP process, but also taking some direction from things that are being, it's like a two-way process, things that are the outcomes from the COP. For example, the focus this year for COP28 for the water agenda is water resilient food systems. There's a focus on food security. It's focused on urban water resilience, and there's a focus on freshwater ecosystems. So that's not everything. That certainly, you start, actually, I've been in meetings, you start speaking, scientists raise their hands and they say, well, what about this and what about that? And this should also be included. But, at this high level, it does set an agenda. It provides a way for us to coordinate our diverse perspectives and our diverse abilities to provide the solutions to that solution space, if that makes sense. And just the way I would break it down is more of an engineering perspective. It's a systems-based approach to addressing a very, very big problem. It's breaking it down and giving the different sectors and people, in the science and technology and engineering sectors, things that they can really focus on, building solutions around.
Thank you. Yeah, hopefully we'll get to some of those solutions in a moment. Hamid Mahmoud is the director, as I said, of the Climate and Water Program at the Middle East Institute. And Hamid has held leadership positions in several organizations, including the chair of the Water Utility Climate Alliance, a coalition of 12 of the US's largest water utilities that collectively provide water to over 50 million people, with the purpose of providing leadership and collaboration on climate change issues that affect water agencies. He's also conducted water management research and work for the MENA region, most extensively on the Nile River Basin, where he's written some excellent stuff, and formalizing the administration of Saudi Arabia's groundwater resources. So I think you have a very interesting perspective from the DC policy world, Arizona, and some of our own unique water insecurity challenges. And I know that you've been working hard on the COP coming up. So please, go ahead.
You know, it's always a tough act to follow Hank and Raha because they're just so eloquent in delivering their points, but I will try my best. But I will pull on a couple of threads that they put forth. And to answer your main question that you posed to all of us, I think part of the issue is that at that level, when we think about the COP meetings and climate negotiations, the UN level, water is viewed at such a very thin lens, and that's kind of what Raha was talking about. But it's so important, to pull on Hank's point, that much of the issues related or impacts related to climate change are associated with water, as well as much of the potential solutions, certainly on the adaptation space, are related to water. And the reality is, it's not just an accessory to a means towards other goals, right? Raha brought forth part of the agenda is always this focus on food security. Very important. Don't want to negate that importance. But you don't get to food security without water security. It's almost impossible. And so making sure the water resources side of things is adequate for you to be able to meet food production goals is quite important. I mean, 70% on average, 60-70% of water use goes towards agricultural activity, which supports food production. So that gets at that point right away. Also, looking at it from the UN level, look at, for example, Sustainable Development Goal 6, to provide clean and safe water. That's a water quality component. So far, you're only addressing water to support food production and water to support for water quality drinking needs. And those are important. Again, don't want to negate it. But water issues are more than that. Water issues isn't just about water quality, isn't just about food production. There's also the drinking water component related to the UN piece. It's about water supply. Do we have adequate water supplies in different parts of the world? Certainly this region, quite arid. Evaporation exceeds the amount of natural precipitation by orders of magnitude. Do you have adequate freshwater supply? Can you then shift to producing non-conventional water supplies, of which this region is quite dependent on when you think about desalination? It's also more than that. It's also about water demand. Where is your water going? We talked about water for agriculture to support food production, a little bit about water for drinking water. Water is also used for industrial needs and development. So your demand impacts the need for water. So that is also a component. And one that I think is also most forgotten or least paid attention to as part of the water component is water conveyance. How do you get water from where it is to where it needs to go? And it's not just a matter of pipelines and channels and that type of thing, because as you're transporting water, there's always the component of water loss, either through evaporation in open channels, water loss in pipeline systems. That's critical water that could be used to meet your demands at the end point. So it's more than just the things we've been looking at. And I think one of the ways to do that, I mean, part of it's an education problem, to make folks aware that it's more than this thin lens that we traditionally view water at these levels of negotiations and meetings. But it's also having the right people in the room, as Raha mentioned, that can talk about these issues and widen that lens when we have these negotiations, so that we really look at this problem holistically and address it at that level appropriately.
Thanks, yeah, and we will get to that sort of connection between energy security also, which the water sector is also a big energy user as well. Henk, given your extensive experience in international water diplomacy at this point, as the first water ambassador for the Netherlands, how can lessons learned from successful water management practices at the national and at the subnational level in places like the Netherlands potentially be applied to address water security challenges in a place like the Gulf, which is a fairly different environment?
I think we can learn a lot from each other from around the world. But to answer that, I also want to relate a little bit to your earlier question and what Mohammed and Raha just said, is that there is a real disconnect between how we talk about these issues and how it works in practice. Because we all agree that food security without water security is impossible. And then we also know that the food sector is drinking away 70, 80, in some regions, 90% of all the water available. And at the same time, in the UN context, with 2 food system summits in the past, there was nothing on water security. So we can agree in a room like this, with less water aware people, you could say, that we have a world with food security without even talking or thinking or agreeing about water security. That is totally possible. That looks ridiculous, but that just happened 2 years ago and this year again. Yeah? So this is not something of 20 or 50 or 100 years ago, and it's actually something of now. Well, in practice, every farmer or food producer knows that it is impossible. Ajay Banga of the World Bank explains it very clearly. When there's no water, there's no food, and then everything starts to fall apart. There's no employment, there's no income, there's no education, there's rising inequalities, and there's death and despair at the end. So, not a good idea, but we can agree on food security without it. So, bridging the gap between the negotiations, climate, food, energy the same. The Ukraine war broke out in Europe, and the first thing European countries and the European Union and finance and energy sector said, wow, energy. Let's figure out how we mitigate this critical challenge. 25% of energy production in Europe is one-on-one related on freshwater availability. We fixed it more or less, figuring out a way out of the dependency of Russian gas. And that was the same summer, which was the 5th or the 6th in a sequence of droughts. Droughts we haven't seen before. So the extremes are only becoming more extreme, and this water scarcity issue is going to be a way worse problem in Europe than any flooding or any sea level rise we've ever seen. So understanding, and this is where scientists go in, understanding the complexity of the problems and facing that, and combining with that with a valuation approach that really knowing that water is a human right and not a commodity, has no price, is going to be critical important in to drive the management of that water and therefore the solution space. So I think, yes, we can learn a lot if only we dare and compare, but at the same time, if we don't bring that learning and that understanding of water to the places where we agree on the issues of food, energy and climate, then that learning itself is not enough. And that is why the COP, as so many of those other places, is becoming so critically important, where there are negotiations, but it is also more and more about how are we going to get this done? What are the solutions that we can bring to scale? What are the validation and evaluation models and the financing behind it? What is the governance we need? I think the how of those solutions and the solutions themselves help inform, or perhaps you could say, if I can use the word mitigate in a different way, help reduce or mitigate the risk of these negotiations going to waste. And I think this is the exact combination. And to your question, yes, in the Netherlands we know a thing or two about wastewater treatment, energy capturing, treating water, but our infrastructure, like also here in this region, and this is interesting, our infrastructure from the past is designed to transport water, being it for drinking or agriculture or mitigating flood. Our infrastructure around the world is not designed for a circular approach, where we keep the water in our nature, where we hold it back, where we store it, where we ensure that freshwater balance is actually in place. So I think we can all learn from around the world that infrastructure in itself as a one-off is stupid and only creates more challenges, while a far more comprehensive approach, taking into account indigenous cultures and knowledge, nature-based solutions, and an inclusive and sustainable way forward can only help us to reach food security and energy security and security at large with that fresh water balance in place. But that means a whole list of other things. Yes, the COP is helpful to that matter if we dare to look this challenging, looming crisis in the eye and say, yes, water is key for everything we value and want to achieve.
Yeah, I like that. I like how everyone needs to learn from not just a one-way cycle on water, but a more cyclical and comprehensive approach to these issues. It seems like I've touched a nerve a bit, that I'm with a bunch of water people in the lead up to COP, and And we have sort of an opportunity, I think, though. This COP marks a pivotal moment with the establishment of a specific water agenda. So Raha, I mean, can you sort of talk to how this agenda can proactively contribute to global water security, considering the interconnected challenges that we've been talking about of food and energy in the Gulf region, but beyond the Gulf region as well?
Of course. We've already talked a lot about the food and agriculture side, so I don't want to expand on that necessarily. And I think on the energy side, we'll speak to that more. I actually want to focus on the nature-based solutions and freshwater ecosystems. And you mentioned that, Hank, in your remarks. When it comes to natural systems, so for example, wetlands, whether they're in the coast or inland, there are incredible carbon sinks in addition to protecting us from things like sea level rise, to protecting the integrity of our water systems, and in helping us manage things like flooding and manage things like in cities, urban heat islands, when you integrate green infrastructure. So I think, from the water agenda, that is the piece that actually I'm the most excited about. I mean, I have spent most of my career has been around ecohydrology and has focused on this, using natural systems to manage water resources in an integrated way. But I'm very happy to see that being really highlighted and being one of the three top priorities for the COP. And I think there's a very specific goal as part of the water agenda for the ecosystem health portion, which is to achieve, I think by, actually wrote it down, so by 2030 to restore 30% of the total global wetlands, many millions of hectares of wetlands. That's really important. But what's important is also how we do that. The how is very important, and the where and the who does it. Because when we talk about integrating things like nature-based solutions in the climate context, sometimes what I worry about is that it gets a little bit overwhelmed by the carbon benefits, and we don't think about the trade-offs with water. So, for example, when you plant a tree somewhere, you may have carbon offsets from, or multiple trees, you may have some carbon offsets or significant carbon offsets. But you're also going to have a trade-off with water that would otherwise make it into your groundwater system or make it downstream. So again, that's where kind of the science and the data are really important, and why we need to take a much more collaborative approach in how we hold ourselves accountable to meeting these targets and how we measure things over time. It's one thing, it feels good to do things, it does. It feels good to say we restored this many millions of hectares of wetland, and we planted this many trees in this country or in that country. Let's say funding came from X place or Y place. But at the end of the day, holding ourselves accountable to what are the real outcomes, and has this actually helped us achieve real success when it comes to our water goals within the climate context, is really important. And so, yeah, that would be the piece that I'm really the most excited about, but also I think we have a lot of work to do to hold ourselves accountable to how we actually implement these things, as hard as it is just to even reach the agreement on what we're going to achieve.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question on that? How do you get people to prioritize that?
I think it's our collective consciousness it seems to have just changed with time. I mean, it's a bit funny, but when I look to the younger generations, it's much more obvious to them. I grew up with this I studied engineering, I studied civil engineering, I was a structural engineer, and then I pivoted. It was such a linear way of thinking. And I think part of that is just the way we've changed. And then the other part of it is seeing examples and having people connect with nature. One of the things, right, yesterday, one of the panelists said, do you know where your water comes from when you open the tap? And is that coming from a watershed, or is that coming from the sea or the Gulf? Understanding that is very important. And again, I reflect a lot, especially in this region, to the history and how close we were to nature, how important water was to Islam, but to the way that we built our cities, the way that we socialized. And that is a connection with not just water, but that's a connection with everything that is water, which is nature, which is food. I mean, it's all of those things, but really, I think to me, it's that natural piece. We need to get back to that time. And I think just one last thing, because one of the other top priorities in the water agenda is urban water resilience. And to me, part of that is also the integration of nature-based solutions, green infrastructure in cities from the urban context. And that's very different in Doha. It's very different in Riyadh. It's very different in this region, in the cities here, than it may be in the Netherlands, than it may be in New York City or in Miami or in Rio de Janeiro or somewhere else in the world. So we have to make it very adaptive to us. And that is also another part of, I think, a call to get more people to think creatively about what is the future of our infrastructure, whether it's green or it's built, what is the future of that? And how do we integrate nature into everything that we do? Because it's figured a lot of things out for us. It's very good at managing water. The natural system is very good at managing water quality, water quantity. And so we need to collaborate a little bit more and become more, have it be more central rather than something that we put aside and we build over.
Right. Yeah, it's very interesting. In my motherland in Jordan, everyone knows where their water comes from because they don't know where it might come from in the years ahead, right? I mean, it's you don't know the importance of water until the wells run dry, right? And so we want to do something before we get to that point, hopefully. I wanted to remind everybody that you can use the QR code on your table to ask a question to any of the panelists, and then it will magically appear here on my screen. But before I get to those audience questions, Hamid, partnerships and collaborations are vital in addressing these sort of complex water issues. So, I mean, what role can a research institution like the Middle East Institute or others, or civil society organizations even, sort of play in supporting governments and international bodies to implement sustainable water management practices and, dare I say, prioritize sustainable water management practices?
Yeah, I think there's a great opportunity, and if not realized, a huge missed opportunity. And I'll use data because we're scientists or former scientists or wannabe scientists, so we like data to illustrate this point. So I think it was earlier this year, towards end of last year, an organization called Arab Barometer that does surveys of countries across the Arab world on different issues. And they did a survey on, largely called under the environment category, but addressed issues of climate change and water. And some of the outputs I found very interesting. So one of the questions they asked was, prioritize what are leading environmental issues in the Arab world, in the Arab region. And generally speaking, I'm synthesizing the information here, they essentially agreed that water issues are the most important. Oddly or ironically, they viewed climate change as one of the least important issues, which addresses maybe a disconnect in terms of information and how these things are connected. And they also recognize things like the importance of water pollution. And so, to me, that tells me that at least at a certain level, at the community aspect, the citizen level, in this part of this broader region, folks understand the value of water. They may not make the connection of implications, how it's connected to climate change or other, but at a fundamental level, they do understand. And so I think that's a great starting point in terms of engaging citizens, or maybe make it formally civil society, in terms of water issues. And when we think of things like adaptation certainly occurs at many levels, at a governance level, at a municipal level, at a city level. but it also very fundamentally occurs at an individual level, at a citizen level, at a community level. And we think about things that Aha mentioned in terms of urban sustainability and adaptation. That begins at home, right? You're more efficient in how you use your water. You're more efficient maybe if you have a garden or landscaping, how you apply water there. So all these adaptations in general, but certainly on the water side, can really start at the citizen level. And that's the cycle of how you get into behavioral change, right? Behavioral change tends to be something that's observed. You know, it's almost a group herd mentality. Oh, you know, she did it. Oh, this is a friend of mine. I like what she's doing. I'm going to do the same thing. Oh, the city set out the standard of how to be more efficient in our water use and green spaces. So the behavioral change that leads into larger change at a larger level always begins, in my point of view, in that small level. So that's the opportunity there at the civil society and citizen level. In terms of the researcher aspect, it's also, I don't think it's a missed opportunity. I think we can expand that, where a lot of innovations that lead to enhancements in how we use water, for example, water efficiency, a lot of technologies in terms of improving water efficiency in multiple sectors, certainly the greatest opportunity in agriculture, has come from research innovation. There's innovations that make drip irrigation even more efficient than what it is. And similarly, innovations in urban water use and industrial use. So researcher, I mean, maybe more technical researchers, but even policy type researchers are important in terms of connecting that technical or deeply nuanced information and data to a larger audience so that they can understand and then, you know, bridge the opportunity to onboard or mainstream some of these technical innovations into larger society. So there's absolutely not just the usual speech, yes, we need to be more inclusive, but there's certain very specific pathways on how you engage research community, both technical and policy, as well as civil society and local citizens.
Yeah, that's really interesting about the Arab barometer, the difference in the gap between water and climate change. I was just chatting with someone the other day and remembering Earth Day, which is one of the most successful environmental movements in history. In 1970, about 20 million Americans turned out. That was about 10% of the American population at the time. And, you know, they turned out not because of, you know, just the environment. There were hardcore environmentalists, but, you know, for the most part, it was because people could see, smell, taste pollution in their everyday lives, right? And I think water provides that linkage for us today. And I think that leads me to a question from the audience, which we've touched on, but I wonder if you guys could sort of get into the weeds on it. Because as we approach COP28, I mean, what are the specific actions and policies that you believe would be necessary to more fully integrate water resource management into these climate negotiations going forward? And I might just add another question from Jonathan Hendry in that if any of you want to speak to it, which is, what are you involved in COP28 this year? And any of you can, Hank, if you would.
Yeah. Also trying to make a little bit of a bridge between what Ra and Mohammed just said and this question on how to bring it towards the negotiations. I remember leading up to the Glasgow COP, being part of a conversation on food security. And, and this was a room less large than this. We're about 40 people in that room, closed door. Decision makers from a political level, from finance, from private sector, policy makers, academics, professors from across the world, way more intelligent than I was. So I was listening for 5 hours, and this was all about food security and climate. And after 5 hours and a lunch, the word water was not mentioned once. So at a certain point in the discussion, I said, hey, how about water in the context of food security and climate? And this whole room turned to me, as being the only water person apparently in the room, said, you solve it. And of course, it's ridiculous because that's impossible, but in the context of where we're heading into your question is that we can use that as an advantage. So yes, we're siloed and we don't make those connections, and we should. But every conversation on water, if you turn it around, is about making those connections. Because everybody has something to gain and lose. It's an individual gain and loss, but it's also an institutional gain or loss. Institutional, public, private, finance, and across, informal. You will always lose something if you don't care of water, and you will always gain something if you do, and more importantly, if you do it together. And this is true on the scale of a river basin, an aquifer, a lake, but also in the context of how we see these downpours and droughts impacting us. And the water space can help bring those solutions that go way beyond only WASH. They are about nature-based solutions and tapping into indigenous cultures, not only in the solution space, but also in the way how we govern and work together. They tap into how we value nature and the environment and help us understand that it's more than a financial value and a short-term win, but it's really about adding value across the board. This is why we designed the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. We find water in each and every one of them. So if we turn that on its head and bring that solution part where water is not siloed up in a water space, but is connected to food, energy, equity, education, capacity, the environment, and beyond, then we can help from the water community, being it academics, being it engineers and practitioners, being it public and private policymakers and developers, innovators and financiers, to that climate negotiations, a way how to solve these issues. So, and yes, then they will be addressed in policies and regulations, in the negotiation space, which is key, but they come from the understanding that water is a key connector across the issues and the ambitions that we want to achieve, and a key connector in undermining them, and understanding that risk and the cost of that risk for human life and suffering, as well as for our economies, and bringing that understanding of that risk into how we approach the added value if we take care of water might even help. We set up the Global Commission on the Economics on Water, which is the third after Stern and Dasgupta. Stern on the economic review of climate, Dasgupta on the economic review of the biodiversity. The Commission shows the insight in how we lose our fresh water and how green water is impacting, increased, exacerbated by climate change, our economies. It helps us understand the economy through a water lens. If that understanding can help drive how the climate negotiations work, I think there's the scare part of it, risk, and there's the opportunity part of it, solutions. And solutions at scale that work in an urban or less urban context, in the industries at risk, looking for an alternative to where we're currently heading, are key. So there's no easy answer to that question. I think water can help by itself and in the connection address the many issues that are part of that negotiation space, and the water-driven solutions across the board help us also bring those solutions for mitigation and adaptation at scale across the world.
Yeah, that's a really good way of thinking about it. I mean, I wanted to go to Raha with the same question, but pose it to you as a scientist, because you were mentioning how scientists need to be more in the room with these discussions. How do you think science, technology can play a role in sort of prioritizing this issue and mainstreaming it through climate negotiations, but also all of the SDGs?
Big question. I will answer that in a moment, but actually I just wanted to share the first thought that I had when you asked the question initially was, people like Hank and others, Mohammed, there's a lot being done to inform this process, right, of what goes into the COP. But what I would really like to see is more countries actually agreeing and committing to the water agenda, and especially more countries in this region. So just that was the first thought that I had, and I think that is very important in national level leadership. then it's everything that comes after that. So a lot of the piece that I really think about and work on is the solution space. How do we implement? And yes, we do need to be in the room as part of the decision making, but then it's the what happens after. Right. And actually just a couple of examples that I think are good ones to share in that. So at the last COP in Sharm el-Sheikh, one of the things that came out of that and was an announcement by the World Meteorological Organization for a program called Early Warning Systems for All. And that is a commitment by 2027 for no country to, or for all countries to have an early warning system. So that means early warning for things like disaster-related things like floods and droughts and even beyond that. So that's quite, when you break it down, that's actually a technical challenge. It's social as much as it is, and governance as much as it is technical, because a lot of our early warning systems actually are supplied by data, and they're supplied by a mix of data, whether it's things that we measure on the ground or it's from satellites increasingly. So this $3.1 billion commitment to help implement this initiative is making its way into programs. And that is, in one, the WMO is part of the UN system. And the strength of that is that it can bring the community together, the community of technologists, scientists, the data providers, as well as those on the other side. That would be on the receiving end, I guess, or on thinking about the applications, not just from a technical perspective. So we need to have people that are part of that dialogue, so that they are working on developing the implementing these solutions. And I think one other thing that's interesting that came out of the last COP was of course, loss and damages is a big part of the outcome. But how do we measure that? How do we account for that? And so one pilot project now that's being led by the UAE, the COP28 presidency team, the UAE Space Agency, and Planets, which we have somebody here in our conference from Planet as well that's working on that, is a loss and damages atlas that uses satellite data. This is not easy, by the way. I'm not saying this is the solution to everything, but it's just an example. It's bringing satellite data into a platform that can help us bring accountability and transparency into how we do this how do we even track what is risk for the countries that would be receiving the loss and damage funds, and how do we take that physical risk and merge it with the vulnerability, and then put a financial accountability to that, and also then add to that where emissions are coming from. We can measure greenhouse gas emissions from space. We can measure things related to impacts of climate change on the ground, whether it's for small islands or large urban areas or entire countries. We can measure many of those components from space. It's not perfect, but it can be a starting point, and it can be a type of platform where we have the scientists, the data providers, technologists, and those on the policy side coming together to have some dialogue. And when you have, data does, I don't mean to just sell it as, again, that's the solution, but it can bring people to the table. It can give us a common language, and it does, very importantly, give a language to nature. It allows us to communicate with a very important stakeholder, which is the natural system, so that we can really measure what do we mean by change. And then you mentioned the SDGs as well. One of the projects I worked on when I was at NASA was SDG 661, which is water-related ecosystems indicator. And what we were finding, no surprise, the world is not on track to achieve SDG 6. There are many, many reasons for that, but one of them is lack of data. So when you don't have enough baseline data to even just know the state of where your water accounting is, where your wetlands are, how much you have, how much degradation there's been, it's really difficult to track change, right? what is progress? If I don't know where I'm coming from, how do I know where I've gone and where I need to go? And so what we did is to, basically show how we can use satellite data. It's not complicated, actually. It's things that are pretty proven methods, data that we've been using for a long time, but they've just been in academic journals largely, and we've been talking to each other and saying, yes, we can do this. But the SDGs, right? This collaboration with UN Environment, who's in charge of SDG 661, it allowed us to have a platform to share that and to make it actually usable and useful. So now, every single country in the world has a starting point data for SDG 661 that comes from satellites. It doesn't mean they have to use it. It doesn't mean they have to agree with it. It's up to the countries to decide whether they use it or not. But it's helpful because they have a starting point, and hopefully that it's helping to build capacity in terms of technology integration and adoption in many countries that need it the most, right? Where there are the most data scarce is also where they're seeing the most impact from climate change.
Thank you. That was really interesting. And also thank you for somewhat answering one of the other audience questions that just came in, which is, how do you use technology and innovation to address sort of the regional disparities and global disparities that we see? And I think that early warning system example especially does achieve that. We're nearing the end, but Mohammed, maybe you could speak a bit to one of the points that Raha made, which is, how do you get governments in this region, which it is the region where 12 of the 17 most water-stressed countries in the world are, to really prioritize this? What are some tangible things that you're trying to do in order to achieve that? And I know, again, you're hard at work on COP28, so if you want to speak a bit to sort of some of the things that you're trying to achieve there, and what makes you hopeful?
It's like 4 questions.
It's like 4 questions. So you can just choose whichever one you want.
You're capable of answering, that's why.
Thank you. I'll offer a perspective that kind of links a little bit to the previous question, maybe transitions to one of the questions you asked, which I think I put in my hat as a former water manager, and I used to work in the US Southwest. The thing about water management, this is sort of both good news and bad news, is unless, for the most part, of course, excluding if you're in an area under conflict or have experienced some form of disaster, natural or otherwise, for the most part, water managers or water utilities or organizations that are managing the acquisition, delivery of water have a handle on it. Because, I forget who said it yesterday, you turn on the tap, the water comes out, that's all you need to know. For example, you drive your car, you don't need to know how your car works to drive your car, you just need to know that that water is coming out of your tap. And for the most part, that is the case. Because of that, it's almost taken for granted and forgotten what it takes to get to that point to ensure water is available for essentially most of the needs. I think when it comes to our aspect of how we manage water, it's the stresses. It's not, again, outside of very exceptional circumstances, it's not necessarily the interruption. So what ends up happening is the issue does not get magnified unless there is a severe disruption into our water systems, right? I use the example in US, Flint, Michigan. When water was not available or polluted water was coming out of pipes, that was a big issue. So people don't pay attention to, and I think Malcolm Gladwell brought this up yesterday, we don't celebrate our successes as much as we magnify our failures. And so whenever there's a break in the system, loosely speaking, everyone is aware of the water issue. But on a day-to-day basis, all the work that's being done isn't recognized because it's a given. It's not a concern. Water's coming out of our taps, our needs are met, the world moves on. So to begin to answer your question, your other questions, is how do we change that? I think it's an uphill battle, but in terms of education, outreach, understanding. And part of that is, pulling on everything we've talked about earlier, bringing in people in the room that are closer to this issue, that are not part of the traditional process. When we think about the COPs, I mean, for a lot of it, it's a political process, right? So you have politicians. A lot of the conversations are around agreements. That's a political policy process. A lot of conversations about financing. That's again, policy financial process. These other aspects of this issue are either technical or scientific, and those don't tend to be part of the conversation because from a policy, political perspective and how things get done at that high level, it isn't viewed as necessary. But I think we're learning otherwise, or at least that's what we're positing to our audience. So that it's a slow process, but I think that's the direction we need to move in terms of incorporating perspectives that illustrate how things are getting done versus just magnifying when things don't work. In terms of, I think what the question even earlier, what are we doing at COP, what our presence will be. Funny enough, actually, and maybe this is a hopeful thing, you know, my program, we deal with climate change issues, water issues, environmental, it's a catch-all for all of that. But most of my engagements at COP this year are actually water-centric. Stuff at pavilions that are focused on climate and water nexus, focused on water from the importance from a public perspective and civil society and citizen engagement, like I was talking about earlier. So to me, that's a good sign that, you know, slowly but surely that the sort of public conscious is now gravitating to incorporating this more into the mainstream than usually has been the case at the COP meetings.
Thank you. I think, Henk, you wanted to briefly comment, and you have the last word before we go to break.
So one thing, Mohammed, in what you said, I hope I did not understand you right, because it's 2023 moving towards 2024. So this is, you know, we should all be in a pretty good place in understanding the challenge. And over 2 billion people, which is more than a quarter of the world population, do not have access to safe drinking water. So there's no tap near. Half of the world population is not close to a tap. So actually would disagree. Yes, for the global north developed world, you might be right, but for the rest of the world, it's definitely not true. And there's no progress there. And linking this to climate is key, because on top of that, health issues in the context of freshwater availability are key and are driven by climate change, you know, in the wrong direction. You know, UNICEF yesterday just presented its new report that's, you know, an increase in health despair among kids. Poor water quality is still driving death and despair among the very young of our world. When you are exposed as a baby to contaminated or polluted water, you have immediate growth impact. And that there is no pill for that. When your brain growth and your body growth are damaged because of poor water quality, forget about it in the context of our global challenges. So, well, this is not a WASH conference. I do want to link this immediately to where climate change is, and that we have no clue as a world on how massive this challenge is. If we had, we would have solved it already. It's 2023 and billions, not millions of people lack that access to safe drinking water, and half of the population to sanitation services, knowing that those sanitation services also emit more than the whole shipping industry. So I think water is bringing us together, and I do agree, at the moment you bring water to the table, it brings all these sectors and silos and individuals and their institutions together. It provides an opportunity to bridge not only across sectors, but also to cross generations, bringing in the young and the more experienced. It helps us understand what climate change really is about and provides a mirror, an alternative to the solutions that we can bring to the table. So yes, I think water is the gem we often forget, a real opportunity for all these conversations. And I think from here to the world and back again, that is the opportunity to show that the climate-related challenges, being them environmental or social or institutional, can be dealt with, starting with changing how we deal with water, and bringing water to that conversation will definitely help.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Hank. I think it's that balance between really highlighting the urgency and the progress that's still needed, but the progress that's been made. And just to pick up on the point that you just mentioned, I was actually looking for these statistics because unfortunately I've had to work on quite a number of cholera outbreaks in the Middle East recently. But I looked up the UNICEF statistics. About 15 years ago, it was 5,000 children a year, or actually a day, sorry. 5,000 children a day were dying of waterborne illnesses. The statistic today is 1,000. So you can look at that in two ways. 1,000 children per day, it's not great, but it's better than 5,000 per day.
Yeah.
So with that, I will leave you all to your breaks. I think we have 10 to 15 minutes, if I'm not mistaken, before the next high-level panel. But thank you, and thank you to our excellent speakers. I look forward to hearing more from, actually, at least two of you later today as well. Thank you. Storm Daniel thing, you know? I
Yeah.
mean, you could say how terrible.
Good luck, thank you. Yeah, I know. The good thing is that you don't see.
Dr. P, did you do that to us?
What did I do?
The blinding light?
I had the lights pointed at each of our eyes,
Yeah.
intentionally.
It's an interrogation.
Interrogation, yes.
It's not so bad. I've been in worse situations where you can't see the audience at all.
Were you giving a rock concert?
What's that?
Yeah, that's the thing. I was like,
rock
what?
concert?
Rock concerts, exactly. Yeah.
They have, like, sometimes you can see them doing.
I hope I can hear you. Yeah, they will soon, yeah. Ready? Are you introducing?
I'm just going to say we're starting, so people stop talking. Okay, everybody, we're going to start the next panel. And the next panel will be on water, biodiversity, and nature-based solutions. It will be moderated by Dr. and Dean Pete Mara from the Earth Commons Institute. Pete, I'll let you take it over.
Thank you. Can everybody hear okay? Good morning, folks. I hope everyone is doing well as we continue on with day 2 of the Sustaining the Oasis conference. So I'm Pete Mara, I'm Dean of the Earth Commons at Georgetown University. I'm also a professor of biology and the environment. Just to give you a little more background, I spent the first 20 years of my career at the Smithsonian Institution at Georgetown, primarily doing science on birds. I'm an ornithologist. I'm also a conservation scientist, so I do work on a lot of different facets of biodiversity and use biodiversity as an indicator of overall ecosystem health in a variety of different contexts and places around the world. So this topic in particular is of deep interest to me. I think we've seen that water is an essential resource, of course, for all humans. We can't survive without it. We've seen that. It's loud and clear, and we all knew that, of course. But I also want to emphasize that there are an enormous number of species of other things on the planet that are also tied into these complex ecosystems that water creates. And so it's not all about humans and biodiversity. Humans are tied to biodiversity intimately, intricately, and inextricably. Without biodiversity, we don't exist. Without water, we don't exist. So there are many, many reasons to protect and maintain water, and biodiversity is a big part of those reasons. Water, again, it impacts it at a very, very basic level. So at this conference, we've delved into the governance, the socioeconomic, the cultural, and the security aspects of water. Today, again, I want to explore the rich ecological landscape of Qatar and the Gulf more generally, and explore some of the efforts being taken by our panelists here and others, including revitalizing wetlands, fostering green corridors, safeguarding biodiversity broadly, and this concept of nature-based solutions and what that really means. So I'm eager to dive into all this with everyone here. So today we've got 3 esteemed panelists, and I guarantee I will mispronounce their name, but I'll do the best I can. And all this talk about water makes me incredibly thirsty. So, so first, right here to my left is Suhair Saeed.
Yeah.
Did I get it?
Suhoor, yeah.
Suhoor. I didn't get it right. Sorry.
Okay.
She leads the Water Management Research Program at ExxonMobil Research Center, developing green technologies for efficient treatment, beneficial reuse of industrial wastewater. Dr. Saeed has 20+ years of experience in the areas of wastewater treatment technologies, water reuse, experimental engineered wetland, biological remediation, ecotoxicology. She is currently acting as the environmental lead for ExxonMobil Global Emergency Response, managing resources at risk, SEMA, SCAT, waste management, and environmental sampling. Next is Mr. Tariq Al-Olemi. Tariq Al-Olemi is Managing Director of 3BL Associates, an ecosystem of social and planetary enterprises with impact in 90+ countries. He holds a number of board and advisory roles, including with organizations such as the World Economic Forum, the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, UNEP and FAO, the UN Climate Change High-Level Champions, Race to Resilience, and the EAT Forum, EAT Forum, which is the leading science-based global platform for transforming food systems. Thank you, Saeed, for joining. And Dr. Aspa Hedzefiemiyu. I totally screwed that up, didn't I?
Totally, like a 70%.
Pretty
Good.
Yeah. Dr. Aspa is a researcher and consultant on ecological conservation and restoration and on environmental impacts of development in hot desert climates. Dr. Aspa received her PhD in ecology and evolution from Rutgers University, USA, and is a certified senior ecologist by the Ecological Society of America. Dr. Aspa incorporates traditional ecological knowledge and ethnography. She develops educational programs incorporating elements from all of the above topics to catalyze citizen science participation and to deepen nature connection and appreciation in the population at large. Currently, Dr. Aspa serves as the ecological research consultant to the National Museum of Qatar, the Earthness Center for a Sustainable Future, and to VCU's, I assume that's Virginia Commonwealth University's, Tangible Lab. Thank you all for joining this morning. And I guess, what I'd like to start with is for each of you to talk about what I call a spark moment. And so we all get connected to nature in different ways, and for many of us, it happens early in our lives. And in the bird world, we call that a spark moment. It's sort of when you've seen you had an experience that's emblazoned in your brain, but it makes a certain connection to the point where you want to kind of go pursue that in your career. So I'd like you to kind of elaborate a little bit more on what you do in your day job, but what connected you to nature first? How did you know you wanted to explore a career in nature?
Okay. Am I audible? Okay. Yes. To be honest, I was not really into environment when I was growing up, but and I wanted to be a doctor, so I'm actually environmental toxicologist. But as I progressed through my career, then and I was working through human health, it becomes very clear that environment impacts human health. And that's the reason that I went into environmental science and environmental toxicology and into later on what I do now. Do we go and talk about what we do?
Sure.
Yeah. So basically, as you, Pete, said, that I'm the water management lead at ExxonMobil Research Qatar, a center for natural-based solution. And mainly what we work on is that we identify and characterize and implement natural-based solutions to create benefits for humans and nature, basically. And we work with different partners that we have our partners in the country, but also with universities, national research centers, and the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change. One of the projects, examples of the projects that we work on includes that we document the co-benefits of mangroves that they provide for coastal stabilization. They contribute to biodiversity, but also how they mitigate climate change and sequester carbon. Another area that we work on, and which I lead, is how constructed wetlands inspired by nature-based solutions, how they contribute into water reuse and so on. So
thank you.
Yeah.
Great. Saeed. Tariq, sorry.
Thank you for the beautiful question. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, I really believe that there are many sparks that keep the fire alive.
Yeah.
I grew up on an island, the island of Bahrain, surrounded by water and very much aware of our ecosystem around us that is sustaining us. I had the spark, and I was in university studying a finance and risk management degree in the midst of the financial crisis. And if that doesn't radicalize you, I'm not sure what does. And really realizing how the economies, the way that we think about economies, are also at the very root of our nature crisis. I was, as a young professional here, I led a youth delegation to COP18 in Doha. And actually really tying into and feeling the power of youth movements and civil society movements when it comes to addressing our climate crisis. And there's these many different sparks. Even this year, the spark for me was I did a climate trip to the Arctic, so out in Greenland. We're able to go out into the icebergs, and these are icebergs that represent a potentially 7-meter sea level rise to an island like mine, which means an existential threat. But you go out there, and the spark is, you hear these, what sounds like explosions going off, like Tinkerbell bombs, like that.
Yeah.
And these explosions are the icebergs hitting the water. And you realize actually the scale, and I think it's very appropriate to have an hourglass here, because it's those kinds of sparks every single day in doing this work that really, for me, keep this passion.
What a fascinating opportunity. What led to the trip up to see icebergs?
This was, actually, it was with the World Economic Forum and a delegation of young global leaders and CEOs of some of the most influential leaders when it comes to industry, mining, and others who should be doing more on the climate crisis, and actually an opportunity to really understand what are the drivers of climate change, understand the latest in climate science, and really in a place like the Arctic that really represents both the barrenness. It's a place that we have not touched as human beings, yet we have fundamentally touched in our economies and activities. And what is the link between decoupling our economies from the melting icebergs?
But I also love the connection to a place like this with the icebergs. I mean, that's just says it all right there. Yeah. Fascinating. Dr. Aspa.
How I got into nature?
Yeah.
Actually, my path is peculiar because I breathe and think of nature all the time, and I'm in nature all the time. So this urbanite setting is a little bit an antithesis of my everyday life. And I went into ecology because I like big picture stories. It wasn't the nature aspect. And at the same time, when I joined my PhD graduate program, I adopted a dog. And so together she brought me, and she still to this day I say that I may be so distinguished as a scientist, but my teacher was Star. That was my best teacher, not my PhD degree, which was amazing, obviously. And since in the last few years, something else has shifted in me because I'm looking into traditional ecological knowledge, and one of the elements that they're introducing, but is always part of their nature appreciation is the spiritual aspect. And so I have incorporated it now, and it brings a more wholesome feeling to the experience, you know what I mean? It's not the technical aspect, it's not the textbook, it's not us using our intellect, it goes beyond that. It's more innate, and you don't have to speak. It's like music, you hear it, but you cannot touch it. It's that sort of a thing. So that is my connection to nature, and if you wanna, if you will, the common thread in my career, because hearing you reading my short bio, I'm all over the place. And I recognize that, but the foundation, the starting point, the return point is nature, and that's who my teacher is. So me spending time in the field is how I learn what I need to come back and contribute to society.
Yeah. Well, along those lines, Dr. Asper, could you talk a little bit about sort of the health of nature here in Qatar and the region? So what's the state of the marine ecosystem? What's the state of the terrestrial ecosystem, whether it's sort of directly related to water or not? But just broadly, give us a sort of a little description of what's the situation here.
Yeah, you're asking me a huge question with a small answer. So the state of biodiversity in our environment worldwide is not very good. It's bleak. And there are 5 threats to biodiversity, and we are experiencing these worldwide. In a local scale, we have some special qualities, and those were discussed in the previous panel as well. So we have scarcity of water, this is a given. Water solutions that could be a possibility in other countries that receive more than our 80 millimeters a year of rainwater are not possible here. So the biggest threat to biodiversity is, of course, habitat loss, because if you take away someone's home and food, then they have to, they either die or they have to migrate somewhere else. And that's not always a possibility for those that don't have wings. So we see a lot of that. And you can see it in satellite images because the human brain works in parcels. So we, on the one hand, we take the land away from wildlife, but that's habitat loss, but we also fragment whatever we haven't taken away from them. So there is no possibility to migrate from place to place. The good thing is that through our development, we're creating artificial habitats. So I'm not sure how many people are from Qatar, and if you know the Al-Qarana lagoons. So these are very big ponds, if you will, where treated sewage effluent is being stored before it can be transported to be used either for irrigation in parks or farms that cultivate fodder for animals. So these are hotspots of biodiversity. And then another artificial habitat is oil rigs. And this is very beneficial because it's a security sensitive area. It's de facto a protected area. Yeah, did I answer your question?
Yeah, definitely a start. Let's bring it back to water and processes that influence, say, marine systems like desalination, which is not just a dominant potential threat here, it's occurring in more places around the world. And I'm wondering, what do we know, and this is open to anybody, what do we know about the desalination process and the reintroduction of brine back into marine ecosystems and what that means for, very sensitive systems and species that depend on sometimes very narrow limits of salinity ranges. And all of a sudden we're disturbing and perturbing these systems. There's got to be some sort of impact there. Are we studying this? Are we monitoring it? What's going on in these systems? Anybody?
Shall I take it again?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
But you guys
One
need
for the
to speak more. I don't want to be a monologue here. So as I said in the beginning, we're not receiving a lot of water. So we are a very poor country in terms of our freshwater resources. But the advent of desalination, boom, has made us very wealthy in terms of this resource. Going back to other unmanaged activities that lead to the depletion of fresh water is agriculture. Okay, it's very not well managed, and it creates desertification through soil salinization and stuff. But if you say it on the other side, agricultural fields also increase biodiversity. It's another system. And so now let's go to desalination, which provides, fresh water for us, and it's very much appreciated. We cannot live without it. The one obvious environmental impact that you have mentioned in Pete is when the hot brine, which is not necessarily chemically characterized, is released back into the sea. So we understand that there are environmental impacts because it's hot, and so it creates a change in the temperature. We do not know exactly the definitive impacts that it has, but we do know that in certain instances within the Arabian Gulf, it has created harmful algal and cyanobacterial blooms, which in turn lead to fish kills. So we know that. And I was at a conference last week where they were talking about water balance, and all the stakeholders in Qatar were present, and we did discuss, technologies where brine can be chemically characterized, and then the different elements can be used by different sectors. You assign a downstream function for the pollutant that causes the environmental impact.
Yeah,
Dr. Z, yeah.
I just want to add to the desalination. What I've obviously heard, because there's a lot of activities to the industry that I belong to, that water challenges is not only outside, it affects every sector of society. And for us, we use water, we generate water, so, and a lot of areas that we operate, water scarcity is becoming very evident. So what's happening is that a lot of industry are also now turning into desalination, and it's not only in the Gulf region, but globally because of water shortages. So I think it's desalination and how to manage desalination and brine management is becoming a global issue as we're all turning into desalination plants and so on. So I think this is where water reuse comes in. It's not only managing and looking at what effect it has on biodiversity, but how do we offset or produce unconventional way of recycling water or using water so we can offset that fresh water and reduce the amount of water, fresh water that we get from desalination plants. So I think it's, if we look at only the problem of the impact it has, but what is the solution so we don't turn into desalination as our fresh water source.
I'll also add, Raha mentioned the importance as well of looking at other financing solutions. And I think desalination is interesting from looking at water as infrastructure and looking at desalination plants as assets as well, also subject to inflation. I think our Dutch colleagues who spoke earlier, I think the Dutch have interesting examples of what it looks like in the past to think about solutions around this. I think the longest standing bond in the world comes from the Dutch Water Board. In, I think, 1648, they introduced a bond that was based on a perpetual bond in order to finance the creation of dikes in the Netherlands. This was done to prevent asset inflation and as well to keep the cost as well of these assets down, not subject to necessarily inflationary forces. But it looked at a more commons-based approach to how we think about infrastructure. And when you think about core infrastructure, such as water-based infrastructure, how do you bring that back to the commons? How do you set it up and finance it in ways that are not subject to inflation, not subject to extraction as well economically and socially? And we're not thinking about our core infrastructure and assets in the region from desalination and others in that particular way. Actually, water is only becoming more expensive, assets are becoming more expensive, the infrastructure is becoming more expensive, subject to privatization, speculation, etc.
Thank you. Just want to remind the audience, please use that QR code and scan it with your phone and send some questions in, and we'll get to those questions shortly. So I want to come back to a related concept, something that sort of seems to have emerged in just the last 5 to 10 years, maybe, this idea of nature-based solutions. And but I want to kind of get more basic with this, and I would love it if you all could just define what is meant by nature-based solutions, and are there standards that sort of define what this is, or is this just has the industry just sort of made this? Is this just an idea and a goal, something to sort of create something that's inspired by nature? But please speak to it a little bit. Educate us all about what nature-based solutions are. Sure.
Yeah. So in simple terms, nature-based solutions is using nature or features from nature to create benefits for humans and environment by tackling societal challenges. And I think, nature existed over several years. People even in rural areas use nature to find to combat the challenge, day-to-day challenges. So it's not a new concept. But I think why we hear more about nature-based solutions nowadays is that now I think we're realizing, and you heard it from the previous panel, that we're not meeting. I don't believe that we're going to meet the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals, and the reason is because we're tackling all these goals individually, like the climate change, biodiversity, water, and people realized that the sense of urgency. And I think that's one thing that I took from Malcolm's speech yesterday, that he was saying that what the difference between, was it Steve Jobs and other people, the geniuses that he was working with, is that he actually said there was a sense of urgency. And I think what we're realizing is that we're not going to meet that target. So we're turning now into nature-based solutions because the inherent diversity and the flexibility of nature-based solutions that brings all these concepts together to tackle issues. So I think that's the reason why nature-based solutions now come into the service and people talking about it. I mean, since I came back from holiday in August, I've attended how many conferences in Qatar alone that are actually talking about sustainability, circularity, nature-based solution. So it shows you that there is a sense of urgency that we need to tackle some of the environmental or societal challenges that we are facing now.
Can you give an example of a successful nature-based solution that you use?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, one of the things that we're working on is constructed wetland. And constructed wetland is inspired by nature. So it's basically, we know that through a lot of science and data that actually natural wetlands work. Through all the processes that involve the vegetation that protects us, from heavy rainfall, and so it protects us, mitigating soil erosion and the transportation or the spread of pollution. And and again, the roots of the plants that are actually stabilizing and contributing to the soil structure and health. Yeah. So then we get the availability of water, and also the replenishing of our groundwater. And the soil, which is obviously that contributes and has an important role, but is underestimated, that it actually controls the transportation, storage, and the transformation of water. And it's made of a very complex living system that has a direct link into ecological health. So all these things, what constructed wetland does is bring all these together to work in treating the primary goal of treating water through obviously the plants that taking up the nutrients from the water, but also filtering out suspended solids. So all these processes and creating that water reuse. So now enabling that water reuse, I said, especially now we're looking into, obviously, which people are not aware, but we actually generate a lot of water, and we use a lot of water in the industry. And imagine if we even 10% of that water is recycled back, it will really contribute a lot into the water resources, especially in a country like Qatar.
So as an ecologist, I've been an ecologist for 50 years, been studying ecology and nature for 50 years. It's a huge relief to see that sort of industry is finally looking to nature as the place for solutions.
Actually, the industry, they do a lot, and they could be pioneers. Is actually, a lot of this innovation, a lot of innovation and technology that happens in the oil and gas industry. Yeah. And so they could be leading the way. And I think, as I said, water was never an issue. Water was free, and you heard that before in the other panel. Water was always free, nobody counted what. But now that we're operating in a lot of areas that is water is, fresh water is very challenging. Yeah. So obviously then we are thinking out of the box, but also climate change. I mean, all these things bring, and people, as I said, realize that if we want to reach our goals, we have to bring all these things together. Absolutely. Green infrastructure, bring them together and make nature work. So that's why, people are surprised that you have a lot of these nature-based solutions, just like us, in the industry is taking place. And I know a lot of other industries that we actually, in Qatar, they're actually also looking at mangroves and looking at other nature-based solutions and things like that.
Tariq, would you like to add to?
Yeah, of course. Maybe I can start with philosophy of nature-based solutions, and then maybe a definition. And I think for me, it always starts from the acknowledgement that nature doesn't just require our protection, nature requires our active collaboration. And that when we look to restore nature and restore ecosystems, we're actually also reclaiming our ability to collaborate is nature itself. And it comes from this acknowledgement that our economies are not these kind of standalone constructs. They emerge from the living and breathing biosphere. When you think of 100% of GDP, 100% of human innovation is entirely dependent on nature. It's entirely dependent on water. It's entirely dependent on the 8 million plus other species that we share this beautiful planet with. And actually, just as we think of public-private partnerships and the importance of stakeholder collaboration, working across with multiple stakeholders, we also should think about what that looks like with other species as well. And actually, what is our role in collaborating with our not only just fellow humans, but the more than human world. And it is spiritual in approach, of course, because it's looking at as well as what's the inner restoration we require, what's the philosophy that we have towards our ecology, how we find our belonging in our ecology, and how we kind of view the nature around us and that with us. And then when it comes to kind of the scientific aspect, from a UN definition, I must say there isn't just one. It's contested. There's very different views depending on which UN department, which public, private sector partner. But I think what we can say is that nature-based solutions are when we restore, manage, protect nature in a way that really leverages its unique qualities, ecosystem services, its unique capacities to find scalable climate solutions, scalable biodiversity solutions that are managed and steered as well in partnership between humans, communities, private sectors, indigenous peoples, and of course that other species. And there's different examples I can point to both in kind of the region and the world that I always find are quite unique, whether it's in Saudi Arabia now where they have large-scale fog harvesting systems with nets.
What kind of harvesting?
Fog harvesting.
Fog harvesting.
Yeah, systems with kind of huge nets as well to harvest the fog. And they're asking the interesting question of who owns the fog? Who owns the moisture? How is the moisture regulated? Is that back into the commons? Is that the private sector? Is it the government? Whether it's also entrepreneurs who figured out that actually through bioacoustics, you can create apps which are able to then record the sounds of frogs in different water streams. And based on how the frogs sound at any given point of the water, it tells you as an indicator of the quality of the water, the pollutants in the water. We're able to decode the sound of frogs croaking and correspond that to which chemicals are in different places of the water. There's in Amman, beautiful mountain goats as well. We talked a lot about space and space technologies here. And through different programs at NASA and a program called Icarus, they're able to actually detect the movement of these mountain goats. And they found that when floods are coming, the mountain goats have detected that actually a few weeks before they're able to move, and we're able to have better disaster risk kind of assessments and responsiveness based on how the goats are responding to the water around us. And there's many others from kind of sand dams that are put in especially drought-affected areas, such as ours, to in rainy season are able to then collect the water, and then in arid seasons are able to then let the water through. But these are many kind of different examples of real innovation and thinking kind of a little bit out of the box of what nature-based solutions are. Even kind of as a last example, because you also mentioned kind of finance solutions. There's an entrepreneur who works between the UAE and Pakistan, and it's called the Goats for Water Initiative. And she found that a big struggle in rural communities especially was they have a lot of access to particular livestock, such as goats, but don't have access to water solutions or solar solutions. So created a whole bartering system and a currency where people were able to exchange goats for water systems, for solar systems, and found that actually in that exchange, using a rights-based method, the goat community actually flourished. They were better taken care of. They were seen as something that was valuable, that was an asset, something to be taken care of, that was part of the economy, understood as part of the economy, and able to have a value of exchanging that for water solutions they're able to purchase. So yeah, I want to kind of offer these as nature-based solutions is very wide, but at its core philosophy is, are we doing this in a way that is not only just using nature, but also in collaboration with nature, that is protecting nature, that's actually giving back, regenerating, restoring the ecosystems and the species in which we're working with.
So several things come to my mind, but I want to touch upon one of the questions that was asked here from the audience. And can we incentivize industry and other folks that are doing things that potentially are harmful to nature and encourage nature-based solutions as long as we standardize what they mean, but through biodiversity credits or other sorts of things that would actually incentivize folks to approach whatever they happen to be doing, whether it's desalination or it's some other disturbance or perturbation to the environment? Can we develop a biodiversity credit system to incentivize these sorts of things, as long as we standardize what and validate what nature-based solutions actually are?
Can you explain the biodiversity credit a little bit more?
I assume it's sort of like it could be a tax credit, it could be some other credit to industry that sort of values, could be a carbon-like credit that values an industry that actually restores a wetland as could be an offset, a mangrove restoration project, could be any number of things that could really sort of encourage those sorts of restorations.
I think the industry starting to use natural-based solutions is a good first move. I have second thoughts about it, because if you listen to what it means to them, it's harnessing the ecosystem services of nature for the betterment of humankind and secondarily nature. So I wish, in my professional career, which is 10 years now, the dialogue has moved in amazing ways towards environmental sustainability. And in the past 2 weeks, I have been part of this panel discussion. We're talking about nature. Yesterday, I was at an eco-schools conference where work that is Qatar-based was presented. Tomorrow, I'm invited in a climate conference. And I'm not saying, obviously, all these things for you to understand how cool I am. I'm saying it so that you can understand that now an ecologist and a conservation ecologist is included in these discussions. And it wasn't like that a few years ago. So I'll give industry this, NBS for the betterment of society. And I wish that within a few years, we can move from wanting to protect nature for nature's own benefit. Yeah. We are one of many, many species, and we're not the center of the world and the keystone species. Yeah. Nature is, if you want to use ecological terms. And then in terms of the biodiversity credit, it's a little bit controversial because the definitions are not very clear. And I do environmental impact assessments. And what we do is we see the design of whatever development, and we assign environmental impacts for every single step of the design. And so we propose ideas of how to avoid the impact, or how to mitigate. And then the other option is, if you cannot do anything about the impact, then you have to do the impact, do the action that causes the impact. You have to propose offsetting options. And so then the debate becomes, okay, so do you want to destroy everything here, the biodiversity, and go to another country and build a wetland? What is going to happen to the ecosystem services that were provided in this area? So I don't have the answer, and I have a lot of discussions now with colleagues on what they think about this, and I don't think that anyone has a clear answer. Yeah. But I would like to hear from Eric what he thinks about the biodiversity credit.
First of all, you are very, very cool, if I may say so.
Thank you.
I think I have maybe kind of two reflections. One of what we're already seeing with the biodiversity credits and looking at do they incentivize the right behavior or not. So far, there isn't evidence to suggest that they do, mostly because a lot of the projects that are associated to the credits are going to happen anyway. It's not like it's an addition to as well, and it's often I see, for example, GCC countries purchasing credits in countries very far away, very disconnected from, their economies, their ecologies, their people, and such a disconnected approach is not often the best incentive to then transform local production systems, local economies, local supply chains, and connection to the global. What I will also say is where this comes into maybe the IPCC discussion, as well as in what are our exits to the climate and biodiversity crisis? And the IPCC kind of points to four different factors. We need the supply side solution, so we need to decarbonize production, and most of the discussion that you have at places like COP are around decarbonizing production. You have the demand side exit, which is how do we reduce our consumption. We have the technology/geoengineering exit as well, and looking at the innovation to save us from our perils. And then, of course, you have nature-based solutions as well. I think across all of that, of course, they're very connected, but the one that I think is the most underused lever that it probably has the biggest power to, I think, unlock this is the demand side. It's the reducing consumption. I think particularly when it comes to water and water use, because we're actually providing an environment where harmful industries such as fast fashion, which is using incredible amounts of water, are not regulated. That there's no desire to degrow those industries. There's not a planned reduction that is planned. And I think it's more that side which we're going to see bigger impacts and effects of really looking at what are the industries that we actually don't need to grow, actually very harmful when they do grow, that they don't serve a necessity for our human well-being and ecological flourishing, and that we don't require. As well. And you can look at many different industries that fall into that category. And I think that incentivizing that, the regulations around that, more than the credits are, I think, what's going to bring us into planetary boundaries.
But isn't one of the fundamental problems that we don't have an economic system that's based on biodiversity value? And we don't really have a way to value biodiversity yet. And so without that, we're sort of, Go ahead.
I would kind of reframe it because it's interesting you bring up the point, because what I'd say is, and I think it was Rahul who mentioned as well around kind of the focus on carbon as well in the previous panel. What we have is an economy that is based on growth and growth at all costs. What we're seeing is that the result of that model is we've overshot 6 out of 9 planetary boundaries, one of which is being freshwater use. We have an approach now to our climate emergency, which is saying that we want to try and decouple GDP from carbon emissions, which scientifically there's not quite a lot of basis for. But even in the attempts in which that we're trying to do that, we are hyper-coupling GDP to biodiversity loss. Actually, we have an economy where absolute decoupling is not really possible. Because absolutely decoupling requires us to look at the entire supply chain, whether it's land grabbing, whether it's rights violations, whether it's kind of gender-based mechanisms, and actually find a direct correlation between GDP going up and biodiversity going down. So actually we have an economy that's, the more that we're consuming, the more that we don't look at the demand side exit of the climate crisis, actually there's no way for us to solve that issue. So it's value plus the very fundamentals of the industries that we're actually supporting.
There is economic valuation of ecosystem services. There is no such a thing for biodiversity. It's even more difficult to give values to that. And then the problem that we're facing in desert environments is that, it's not a climate system that has, where the ecosystem services have been evaluated within our context. So I cannot apply the valuation, even in a habitat that we have here, So let's say mangroves. So the benefits and the ecosystem services that we get that are of value are not the same that our fellow world citizens in Indonesia get. So we don't get timber, for example. We don't get, food sustenance from the mangroves. We don't use the mangroves as a place where the community can have economic benefits because they're doing community tourism, etc.
Yeah.
So there are intricacies that are place-based, and there are intricacies in how do you value biodiversity.
Yeah, it's funny because bringing it back to water, the blue economy is a place where you'd think we would have even more direct linkages with our economic health, just because we still harvest wild species from the blue economy. We still depend on, and we're building other nature-based economic growth pattern with oysters. We're harvesting things that are more sustainable and building infrastructures that are more sustainable tied to the blue economy. And I think there's a lot of potential there, but we still don't really tie a value to it like we could to demonstrate to society how closely linked we are to nature. What were you going to say?
I just want to add just one point to biodiversity and how we advocate for getting credits for biodiversity. I think a lot of people who make decisions about these things are not really scientists. So my worry is that as a scientist, that if you advocate for that and you say we need to recognize biodiversity, it might have a negative impact rather than what we're trying to achieve. So I think, as we always say, knowledge is power. We really need to make sure that we empower scientists and people who know about these things, because not a lot of people know about what biodiversity is. They don't know about ecosystem services. So there's a lot of ignorance in that area. So I think we need to be careful. And that's the reason why what Tariq was saying, carbon credits is not what it's intended to be.
Sure.
And a lot of industry, especially our industry, we're always sensitive about that.
Yeah, well, we always talk about habitat restoration and nature restoration, and it's always seemed pretty clear to me that the one restoration that we really need to really work hard on is our own individual connection to nature and restoring that ecological belonging that we all as humans should have to nature, and then hopefully we will respect nature more for that reason. So I'm totally doing a horrible job of all the questions that are coming in from the audience. The last one that just came in was for Dr. Aspa. Is greenwashing an inhibiting factor for climate innovation in Qatar specifically, and how can environmentalists combat greenwashing globally?
I'll take a little bit of greenwashing any time of the day if the bigger benefit is worth it. My name has been used for greenwashing in Qatar. My name, Dr. Aspa, my name, has been used for a little bit of greenwashing, but the benefit of this greenwashing was vast. A restoration project was initiated from this little greenwashing. So there is always critical thinking that needs to go inside that. That is my radical thought on greenwashing. I don't appreciate it if there is, no good end point and it's just, and it stops there. But in life, nothing is black and white. If it was, we would not be sitting here, all these beautiful minds, trying to figure out what is the best solution, how to go back to nature, and not treat nature as colonialists. Why were the indigenous people more wise than us? Because they understood what the limiting resources were, and when they would get, close to the end, they would move. They will not try and extract and extract and extract, and this is what we do. And that's why my wish is that we go from saying nature-based solution for the betterment of humanity to protecting nature for her own right.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. We've just got a few minutes left, and I like the idea of sort of ending on a hopeful note. And hoping I like what the last panel did and sort of asking each of you to sort of tell us why you're hopeful for the future of biodiversity and the challenges that we're facing with respect to water and the biodiversity that depends on it. It's a tough question.
Yeah, tough question, yes. Look, I'm very hopeful because as Bo was saying, we're all here to tackle environmental or societal challenges. So I'm really hopeful that we continue. I mean, I've been in Qatar for 13 years, and I can see the dialogue is becoming more frequent. We're talking about nature and the challenges that we have. So I think if we continue talking, there is that it's going to, fall into those decision makers to take an action. I hope that we continue talking. I hope that a lot of other stakeholders like industry, policymakers, and research institutes, which is the foundation where we get our information and also make a decision based on science. So all these institutes, for us, it was a surprise. Georgetown working on environment. So it's a beautiful thing to see. Like university like Georgetown is actually taking the initiative and the Earth Commons and so on. So I think I'm very hopeful. I feel like we all know the urgency that we are all facing, and that all sectors of the society are also facing these challenges, and that's the reason why I'm here talking about this. We're all facing the same issues. It's just that I think what we need to build is the trust. And say, you are responsible, it's just to collectively come together and tackle and collaborate and just solve the problem. I think I'm hopeful and I'm optimistic.
That was awesome, and I really appreciate the plug. Tariq?
Yeah, I think for me it's easy to be hopeful, particularly in the work that we do at the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, because I get to meet and engage with incredible projects around the world that are restoring ecosystems, that are doing nature-based solutions. At the moment, the UN Decade flagships are restoring the equivalent of size and landmass of the country of France, and it's growing. And for me, it's hopeful to see the standards in which that's based on. It's rights-based standards, they're measurable, they're specific. It's prioritizing nature-based solutions that are led by local communities, locally contextual, that are gender equal. It's nature-based solutions that are based on not economies of extraction, but economies of regeneration. It's nature-based solutions in real partnership and a real stakeholder approach. And it's nature-based solutions that are solving real challenges to our biodiversity crisis. And we see that it works. We see that it can be done at scale. We see that it can be done even bigger. It requires that willingness. It requires the mindset as well. And it requires us to make that choice to do such work, which we know is possible.
Thank you. Dr. Aspa.
I'm a hopeful person by position, and just being here today makes me very hopeful for the brighter future. And, at the end of the day, who will lose the battle if we're not getting our acts together? Us. So that makes me hopeful. But kidding aside, and that was something that you were supposed to ask me and you haven't, so I'll speak to it. There is a very important collaboration taking place in Qatar right now, and it's on mangrove restoration. So it's a program funded by MSC Foundation. It's a grant to QF's EarthNA, and we are closely collaborating with the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, Qatar University, and Agrico is our partner who is keeping up the mangrove seedlings. So we are expected to add 50 hectares of mangroves in the natural setting, and right now we have 26,000 seedlings that will go to plant 2 hectares in situ. So, and I'm sitting here as the chief scientific officer, but there are, many people who are passionate and are overcoming the difficulties that we're facing when we're working with nature. She always gives us adventures. So this is, we're putting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, I'm hopeful because I've met the three of you and I see how passionate you all are for doing great work in nature. And great to meet all of you, and thanks, sir, for your attention, and look forward to interacting more over the next day and a half. Thanks very much.
Thank you,
Thank you very much, Pete.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
The questions were all over the map. They were like some of them were challenging, challenging her severe ExxonMobil and climate commitments. I just feel like
We are. Okay, we are going to go right into the next panel. So I just want to acknowledge that it's been a very intense program. And that was, in ways that was by design. It was not to overwhelm everybody or to exhaust you. But really, we had 2 days, and this sense of urgency that Malcolm Gladwell talked about is something that we felt if we were going to cover this topic, we wanted to do it justice and really cover it in a holistic way. And of course, it's already come up a lot. The strong connection between water security and food security, especially in this region, especially in Qatar, but in many places in the world. So I'm really happy and excited to introduce the next panel to please come up and talk about not just food security and how that's connected to water, so the water-food nexus, but also the geopolitics in this region in particular. So if I can have you actually come on up, and we have Ms. Zahra Babar from Georgetown University, Qatar will be moderating this panel for us. And Zahra, I'll let you take it from here.
Yep, and then Logan's right next to you. It's volume, so. Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Raha. Actually, I want to thank Raha as well as Jamie Olson and other colleagues at Georgetown University in Qatar for so generously inviting me to be part of this important conversation. I feel privileged and honored to be here. As Raha said, my name is Zahra. I work at Georgetown University in Qatar at the Center for International and Regional Studies there. And if I was to spend or to do due justice to introducing these four gentlemen, we'd probably be here until tea time, so I'm going to make it quite short. I think you've already had the opportunity to meet Professor Giordano. Mark Giordano is a colleague of mine, but at the Washington campus of Georgetown University. He's a professor of geography and vice dean for undergraduate affairs at the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. His research focuses on international political dimensions of water, agriculture, and the environment. Next to Mark is my friend and colleague from within our campus. This is Professor Logan Cochrane, who is at Hamad bin Khalifa University. He is an associate professor there at the College of Public Policy. His research is extremely diverse, both from a disciplinary as well as geographic perspective, but he works on themes of food security, climate change, social justice, and governance. Next to Logan, Mr. Ali Abu Saba is part of the Consortium of International Agricultural Research Centers. It's a long mouthful. I hope I got that correct. He is their regional director for Central and West Asia and North Africa. He is also the Director General of the International Center for Agricultural Research in Dry Areas, as we all know, ICADA. And next to Ali, we have Dr. Mohammad Hussein Imadi, who is joining us from Iran. He is Iran's former ambassador and permanent representative to several UN agencies based in Rome, including the Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Food Programme, and IFAD. He has more than 40 years' experience in agricultural food systems, rural development. So, as Raha mentioned when she invited us to the podium, the topic of food and water and the nexus has been already raised several times, including in this first panel that I attended this morning. But we're hoping in our conversation today to delve a bit more deeply into the geopolitics around food security and also specifically focusing on the Gulf. About 12 years ago, at the center where I work at Georgetown, we were talking about discussing the idea of doing a project looking at food security in the Middle East. And having spent about 15 years working in poverty alleviation and rural development in South Asia, obviously I started focusing a lot of attention for that project, looking at the parts of the Middle East where we know, which we traditionally assume are deeply food insecure. And the Gulf states, the 6 monarchies, were not really within my vocabulary. And I remember these discussions when I was saying, but, you know, how can the GCC states possibly be food insecure? These are largely wealthy, resource-rich countries in terms of financial wherewithal. Surely we can't consider their populations to be food insecure. The world's hungry. Numerically lie in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Isn't that what we're talking about? We're talking about addressing food security. So I think what I'd love to start this discussion off, and this is not because I'm biased towards Mark, who is a geographer, but because I'm always interested in complex terminologies and complex geographies. We take it for granted that all of us know what we're talking about. We're talking about food insecurity or food security as though we're from one place in the world and everything's to be addressed in that way. But the world is complex when it comes to geography. So I'd like all of you, from your own perspectives, to think a little about this point. What is food security? What is food insecurity? Are we all on the same page? And what are the ways in which we can think about addressing this when we know how complicated the geography of our world is? Can I ask you, Mark?
So I'd just say one of the problems that's been mentioned a number of times is the lack of awareness of where our water comes from. And including a couple of discussions yesterday mentioned that even people here in Doha don't realize that the water coming out of their tap comes from the desal. But I think generally the lack of understanding is much deeper, because while that is in this place, that's where the drinking water comes from, that's maybe 10% of total water consumption, because the majority is coming from what was used to produce the agriculture that's feeding all of us while we're here. And globally, of global calories, 60-something% are wheat, rice, corn, and soybeans. And if you look at where those are produced, it's maybe 8 regions of the world, pretty small regions that might cover 5% of global area, produce more than half of all of those. And then once those are produced, when they go into the trade system, they go through maybe 5 sets of ports and rail systems, part in the US, in part of South America, coming through the Black Sea, Indo-Ganges, the ports in India, ports in Southeast Asia. And then from there, it passes through just a few choke points, the Bosphorus, the Panama Canal, Malacca Strait. So what you have is this, that all the food that's coming to us here in this spot starts in from pretty narrow areas to finally get here, which means that if you're talking about the global water system, if it doesn't rain in Australia, that means the wheat that is imported here may not come here, or maybe at a higher price, or moving from the natural to the political. If there's a drought in India, the first thing the Indian government is going to do is restrict the rice exports that come here. Or when there's a war in Ukraine, suddenly there's no grain flowing through the the Bosphorus. So just to say, the water, there's the direct consumption of water, there's the indirect consumption of water through agriculture. This particular spot is perhaps the most dependent on the global agricultural system to keep feeding itself. So water, food, geopolitics are completely intertwined here.
I think we saw that directly in Qatar on several occasions, including post-geopolitics, but even before that, you know, some grain bans. And I think that's one of the things that made it an imperative for the country to start thinking along the lines of very strategic approaches towards addressing their food supply. Logan, would you like to pitch in?
Let me start large and zoom in. And by starting large, I can say over a couple of decades, we saw progress on food insecurity improving around the world. That continued, let's say, from the 90s until around 2014, 2015. And then both the percentage of undernourished people and the aggregate number of people who are hungry around the world started to increase. And this was primarily due to conflict. And we saw then, at that time, South Sudan, and then Yemen, and so forth. So what I want to then narrow in on in our region, and building on what we just heard, is the geopolitics component of this session. We've got food security, and then so what are these geopolitical, and to connect it with all of us, when we go home this evening, we turn on the TV, we will see Gaza, undoubtedly. And they, of course, have had a blockade since 2007. And I want to move backwards slightly. The Ukraine war, which you mentioned, the region was heavily reliant on food from either Ukraine or Russia. And just to give you one example of this, if we look at Egypt, 100% of its barley imports were from Ukraine and Russia. 100% of its sunflower, the oil and the seed, were from Ukraine and Russia. 100% of its, 86% of its wheat were from Ukraine and Russia. And when you have a conflict in this region and you are unable to export from the ports, that significantly affects this region. I just picked Egypt, but recently Dr. Sultan Barakat and I looked across the whole region to see a dependency and risks, geopolitical risks out of that. We go back slightly before that, we all experienced global supply chain disruptions due to a public health measure. Go back slightly before that here, if you're living in the state of Qatar at that time, there was a blockade of the state. 90% of the food previous to that blockade was imported from our regional neighbors who imposed a land, sea, and air blockade. That posed a significant food security shock to the system. And maybe in follow-up questions, I can explain a little bit about what the state of Qatar has done in responding to those challenges. But just to emphasize the importance of geopolitical in this conversation of food security, we just keep going back and we have more and more disruptions. Outside of the conflict space, we had disruptions related in West Africa to Ebola, in South and Central America due to Zika. And you keep running back that geopolitics related to public health, related to conflict, related to economics, related to boycotts and bans and restrictions of food exports. Food was restricted after the financial crisis, for example, in the triple crisis of finance, food, and fuel after 2007 and 2008 financial crisis in the US. So this is something we've been regularly experiencing almost every year or every 2 years. And I mention all these examples just to highlight the critical importance of the geopolitical in this conversation of food security.
Thank you so much, Logan. That I think builds on some of the work that Ali, you have previously done, because earlier we were speaking about the fact how you have done a lot of work in areas where conflict has been one of the biggest impediments to taking the sort of important research work that organizations like ICADA engaged in and actually implementing those towards important food security goals becomes problematic when you're dealing with these sorts of geopolitics. Could you build on that a bit?
Absolutely, and I think it's important here at, in Qatar, part of the GCC is part of the larger Siwana region where, the drylands, an important part of the drylands are, and where water is the most limiting factor. Logan had, and the predecessors spoke about, some of the challenges, and I want to bring specifically the 2008 food crisis, price rise, and more recently the COVID and the global disruption of the food supply chains. I think has driven many of the countries in the region and across the world to rethink the whole concept of food security. Now, we need to understand that food security, as much as it's a lot of economics, a lot of strategic planning, it's also a very important sovereign issue. So every country will decide for themselves how to interpret these concepts and then develop their national plans and strategies to cope with this in the way that suits them the best. And the complexity that we have here is the water scarcity and the added complexity of the geopolitics in the region. So it's very important in the planning process to understand the opportunities and the challenges. The opportunities in the drylands more broadly is that it's capable of producing almost half of the food that we produce on the planet. So in terms of potential, it's huge. But the question is how you deal with some of the limiting factors, not just only water, but the geopolitics, as mentioned by my colleagues. And I think, the GCC also, as a group of countries, have enormous opportunities for collaboration around the issues of agricultural research, water research, splitting and sharing the agenda and learning from each other. And I think some of the work we've done here in the GCC is to really define in a very collaborative way what the challenges are for the region and trying to bring the countries together, to think together, to develop together, to test and adapt together, and then from there draw in the policy evidence, the science evidence to be able to make policy decisions. I can elaborate a little bit more probably later on about some of the technological opportunities that have been developed in the region and how it is helping countries to produce the minimum amount of food they need to produce in case they have to. Because the issue is about being able to know how to produce food, not necessarily to produce it all the time, because like others mentioned, it may not necessarily be the most economic option to resort to. We can discuss that a little bit later. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Dr. Mahdi, I think it's extremely valuable to have your input on this panel because we're talking about the Gulf, and what frequently happens is a lot of the discussion gets focused on the 6 monarchies and their conditions, the 6 Arab monarchies' conditions for food security, and the ways they're addressing it are different from how Iran has both the capacity to address it as well as a difference in natural resources. I'd like you to provide that perspective, but I think building on what Ali just said, and given your previous experience with the Food and Agricultural Organization, with IFAD, what are some of the transnational ways in which these organizations are helping to bridge the gaps in how we address food security in the Gulf?
Actually, as my colleagues mentioned, the food security in the region is really very, very sensitive and in the meantime very fragile. Although there is a different country with a different strategy, as you mentioned, from Iran up to the GCC countries. But in the meantime, we are facing with the 3 capital C, which make the situation much worse. One is climate change, which actually our region is one of the most fragile area of the world, which makes the food security much more important for all countries. And second C, of course, is conflict, which we are in the center of conflict. As you can see, the impact of sort of war with Ukraine and also Gaza, and the blockade and the sanction. The most impressed countries in the world are in the same region. And the third C is the COVID, which we call it pandemic in general, and it's repeatable based on the immunologist prediction. Therefore, the region are in the center of the sort of boiling point in terms of 3 capital C that I mentioned. And in the meantime, we have a different strategy among different countries. Some of them buy the food security with their purchase power based on the money that they got from the fossil fuels. And of course, not only food security, but also water security by the very cheap energy that they can use, desalination. And in the meantime, we have countries which are a little bit different. Of course, Iran is one of them. During the last 40 years, Iran changed their strategy based on the revolution, and also in the meantime, they invested in agriculture highly, and try to be independent in terms of economy based on oil. And from 4 million barrels 40 years ago, now we are in about 1 million with a 2 or 3 times population. Therefore, we are facing with the challenges in the other side. which is pressure on the resources, particularly water, in such a way that we come up to the degree of bankruptcy, water bankruptcy. Therefore, I think the different strategies in the region come up with huge problems, both sides. The one that buy the food security and the one that put a lot of pressure on the resources, particularly the water and the land and the soil. In this matter, I think, based on the 3C that I mentioned and all facts that we can see during the last 40 years, it's a time to rethink and change the strategy in such a way that look at the food security in different definition. And in the meantime, United Nations, particularly FAO and HLPE, which is a high panel of experts which are thinking about the definition of food security, they also are thinking differently from the meaning and the concept of food security. The food security is not the same meaning that we had it 40 years, 10 years, and even 5 years ago. And now there are lots of indicators that are adding. For example, as we all know, food security is food for all, in all times, in a stable situation for access to the healthy, nutritious food. But at the moment, the HLP just about 3 weeks ago issued a sort of paper which says that there are lots of other indicators for food security, which with these food security indicators, I think we need to rethink about food security in the region, either the people or the countries which buy the food security or the countries like Iran which put the pressure on resources and abuse the sort of natural resources in such a way that I will discuss it and elaborate it later on in the next session.
No, thank you so much. I think that comes very much back to the first point we had, where Professor Giordano was saying similar things, that this is not it can appear as almost a zero-sum situation where enhancing food security for one country might end up damaging some form of either environmental resources or in other cases actually damaging food security in another part of the world. I also want to pick up the point of food sovereignty, because I think that, again, is a really important concept, which is understood differently in different contexts. In the GCC states, of course, it was very much around the right to control your food sources, which led to the emergence of plans to grow food indigenously, which, of course, creates all kinds of problems for water resources. And you were talking about this earlier, Mark. Can we, so is it a zero-sum thing, and how do we go about making sure it's not?
I'm going to shift away from your question slightly and maybe come back to it. But Ali reminded me of an important point, that it is connected to why it doesn't need to be a zero-sum game, but why there's also an issue of, there's a geopolitics that maybe most of us haven't thought of before. If you're trying to have agriculture that responds well to changing climatic conditions, in particular in this area with increased drought, increased variability, you have to have seeds that have the genetic material that you can draw from. Jakarta has, I think, the best collection of these seeds in the world. And where is the seed bank, or where was the seed bank? In Syria. And so suddenly when the conflict starts in Syria, this seed bank that has all the genetic material that you need for the best adaptation to a changing climate is endangered and has to be, people risk their lives to get the seeds out of the country and put them somewhere else. So just that, there's the immediate geopolitics of the food delivery, there's the longer term geopolitics of who owns genetic material, how do you keep it safe, how do you diversify it, so that you can continue growing food with the changing water environment, so that you can reduce the zero-sum aspect of many of these, related to the question that you just asked.
Right. Logan, you had mentioned earlier, I mean, building on what Mark just said, more solution-oriented, both scientific, technological, and other solutions which may also be political and social. You were going to talk to us a bit about what Qatar has done. You had some ideas on that.
I will leave the technological innovations for my colleagues, but maybe I'll share what the state of Qatar has done. And before I do that, I know Dr. Masoud Al-Marri, Director of the Food Security Department, is not able to be here with us, but to acknowledge his leadership over the last years on this, and I'm just sharing what they've been doing. So as mentioned, the blockade, land, sea, and air, 90% of the food being imported before 2017, primarily from the countries that imposed the land, sea, and air blockade on the state, presented a serious food security shock. What to do in such a scenario, and then how to develop a more resilient food security system for the long term. And as we all enjoyed our break and our fresh berries and pineapples and so on, we overcame this as a country. So what are some of the key initiatives? And if you're interested, there's a food security strategy for the state that's available, but I'll just highlight a few of these. One of them was expanding and being much more evidence-based on having a national strategic food reserve, so that if there was a shock, whether it was conflict-related, geopolitically related, pest, disease, global health, we can go down the list of potential risks to food supply, that the state would, at least at essential and emergency levels, would be able to provide needs for the people for at least a 6-month period. And this was an immediate response, but it required a lot of work. You need to have the facilities, you need to have the evidence to pick the commodities, the sufficiency of the quantities, the monitoring mechanisms so that the commodities don't sit and expire and you're rotating. So this sounds like a simple initiative, but it's quite a large initiative. This is one of the 4 pillars of the food security strategy. A second pillar was increasing domestic production. And we've heard about some of these challenges of increasing domestic production. And there have been some successes. The state recognized in the beginning this isn't an agriculturally rich place in terms of its soils and water resources, so this needed also to be strategic. And we now have 100% of our dairy products produced domestically, and significant improvements in a number of vegetables, fish products, some meat products, etc. These are not random, they were part of the strategy. A number of these targets have been met or surpassed. And previous to 2017, production in most of these domains were minimal. So a really rapid transformation in the agricultural production sector. Then that's the second pillar. The third pillar is around markets. You want to have an efficient marketplace that distributes the materials that you produce, as well as those that you're importing, to avoid food loss and avoid food waste. And this required a lot of market reformation, storage facilities, you see new markets being emerged, fish markets emerging, and so on. So this was pillar number 3, focusing on domestic markets. Pillar 4 is diversification of imports. Over the long term, the state of Qatar will continue to be a net food importer of food. We will not be food self-sufficient as our own production sources. So how do we mitigate the risks that we previously experienced, where a large share came from one country? And if that one country decides to use that as leverage, that becomes a risk. So how do we diversify that risk? And this was through import diversification measures. There were a number that were set in the strategy, and this has been the most difficult to achieve. You can imagine if one is importing frozen chicken, as the state of Qatar does from Brazil, and it is the cheapest on the marketplace, then it's difficult to diversify unless you're going to hand down those costs somewhere to the government or to the consumers. And so this has been sticky, particularly when the government isn't procuring these items, it's the private sector. Other examples could say that we shifted reliance from one country to another. If you look at now imports of a number of fruits and vegetables to the state of Qatar, large shares come from Iran, our neighbors, which was important. We needed to overcome that, but we've moved from dependency to dependency, and we have faced some challenges on achieving food diversification from the import side. So those are 4 pillars of the food security strategy, some of the lessons on how do we move towards a more resilient food security system for the state of Qatar. But I'll add a 5th pillar, which is invisible in the strategy, but is an enabler for all of these things to take place. And over the last 20 years, the state of Qatar has invested in enabling infrastructure. So this includes ports, this includes aviation and logistics infrastructure, highways, roads. It includes developing the free zones in the last 4 years. And if you've visited, you can see a rapid development in the free zones in this very short period of time. And working with the Qatar Investment Authority, one of the world's largest sovereign wealth funds, as well as Hassad Foods, which makes similar food investments domestically and abroad. And all of these are enablers for the strategy to be successful.
Thank you so much, Logan. Very thorough and thoughtful summary of Qatar's, the approach they've adopted to addressing their food insecurity. Just one quick question follow-up. About a decade ago, when not just Qatar, but other Gulf states were also receiving quite a lot of media scrutiny for these supposed investments that they were making overseas. And a lot of the concern was that they were purchasing land in other parts of the world and that this would produce all kinds of vulnerabilities for communities there. Do you have anything on that?
There has significant investment on if we want to call it large-scale land investment or large-scale land acquisitions or the land grab or, pick a name, the foreign direct investment in the agricultural sector. It goes by lots of names. If you want to research it, I have a recent book on this topic if you get bored. So there's a lot to say. In terms of Qatar's investment internationally, it hasn't been significant in terms of the farm-to-plate supply chain. So you're the farm-to-plate supply chain would mean you purchase farmland in X country, let's say Sudan, where the state of Qatar does have investments, and you control the complete supply chain from the farm to the plate. Some countries have made more larger investments in terms of land size, in terms of geography, in terms of financial investments in this. And I would say the long story short on this is that it's been much harder than some of the investment authorities thought it would be. There are many geopolitical risks, and if you're a country that thought Sudan would be a wonderful place to invest, which used to be, in the 70s we talked about Sudan as the breadbasket of Africa, and it has this potential to be the breadbasket of Africa. Geopolitics makes it maybe a much more riskier place to make an agricultural investment. So a lot of other factors have played into rethinking investment, and if you look at where Qatar Investment Authority does make its investments, as well as Hassad Foods, it's increasingly less on land and in other forms of the food system.
Thank you. Ali, I wonder if we can go back and dig further into the set of innovation and technology side of things, particularly because of the sort of work the organizations you represent do. And we have already, I'm delighted to say, some questions from the audience, so please keep them coming. The barcode's on your table. But the question asks specifically on what role can technology and innovation play, particularly when it comes to addressing food security issues in arid zone countries like the Gulf, which have these challenges, climatic, also lack of arable land and water resources. What are the advancements that are being made that can be deployed not just here, but in similar countries?
Okay, well, thank you so much for the question, because I think I also would like to emphasize that the innovations are not only physical innovations. I think just maybe a couple of comments on my predecessor, and before I come into this point, the whole question of diversification is key. And that the implementation of the diversification approach by itself is an innovation. Diversification in the way you design your cropping systems, the way you exploit your available natural resources, and the way you deploy opportunities from across the globe to your own local context. If I jump a little bit into the future, like 20 years from now, I think we are going to reach a stage where we have to eat what we can grow, rather than insisting on growing what we would like to eat. And that is going to be a major shift in thinking of humans. Now, whether it happens 20 years, 50 years, or even after 10 years, I cannot tell with any degree of precision, but I know for sure it's going to happen. So, for example, in the state of Qatar, where I have to really emphasize, they made exceptional progress in planning and implementing specific measures to deal with the whole issue of food security. But I think the system is still vulnerable, because with the self-sufficiency on dairy, the animal feed comes from Sudan. And for most of the GCCs, a lot of fresh imports of bersim, for example, right? So one of the things and innovations is that we are now developing cactus, something that grows well in this environment, as a substitute to animal feed. You can actually use up to 30% of your mix using cactus. And probably in the future, we're going to work on making cactus a little bit more nutritious, so that becomes a substantially higher percentage in doing so. If I take another example from the region, Egypt. Egypt is one of the largest importers of wheat in the world, which is, a shame, I have to say. I'm from Egypt myself, by the way. And they produce half of it, they import 10 million. And you've emphasized it comes from Ukraine and Russia. So when the conflict started, there is panic because there's a huge national security risk to have 110 million hungry people. And in Egypt, people eat bread 3 times a day, and the Minister of Supply will tell you he produces 750 million loaves of bread every single day. So what we have done, we've gone back to the gene banks. We've found that Egypt traditionally consumed large quantities of barley. So we started to look at what the gene bank can offer as close as it can possibly be to wheat. And we've done experiments to demonstrate the science evidence behind a policy decision to substitute up to 30% of a wheat barley flour mix that significantly enhances the food security of Egypt. So that's an innovation, because you would displace 6 tons out of your 10 tons imports of wheat, and then significantly improve the sense of and the reality of food security. And I think in this region, the potential to look more at what traditionally has been growing. I think you have date palm. You have many other traditional crops. Even when it comes to the whole issue of feeding the animals, plenty of other choices of natural habitat, natural plants that could be developed further. The reason why wheat is doing so well, because of 50 years of investments in research and development. So why don't we start to look at a much broader basket that God has created in the gene banks, and look at every country context and how we can actually invest in making those species and natural potentially items that you can grow for both food and feed for the animals. So these are just some examples about the work we do and how we can actually deploy science to deal with some of the challenges. My last point, just before I close, the rising temperatures and the climate change, which is really the whole thing that is driving the conversation here. The drylands is likely going to lose up to 20% of the total production capacity by the year 2050, simply because of the rise of 4 to 5 degrees increased in temperature. And I'm really happy because for the past today and yesterday, we've heard a lot of emphasis on the 4 and 5 degree scenarios, where most of the other global events, people speak about the global average of 1.5, which for the layperson sometimes may not be providing the real accurate representation of what's going to happen in this region. So I really commend the speakers of having been speaking so directly to the issues. Thank you.
Thank you. That's great. Excellent, but it's got me onto a philosophical sort of point of mine that, about 15 years ago, I was shouting at everybody and saying, don't eat quinoa. And that is because I have a firm belief that, that you mentioned the importance of growing particular grains that could do well in Egypt and could be consumed locally. But the problem is, food is not just a right, and it's not just produced for food security and to feed people who are hungry. It has become a commodity, which is traded. And the next thing you know, perhaps barley becomes super globally, everyone wants it. So it's leaving Egypt and being eaten in Finland instead. So this to me is a problem, is that we're used to thinking, we have become attuned to thinking of having food of whatever preferences available to us year-round, wherever we are. And this is a problem, right? Anyway, we can move away from my philosophy to move on to Dr. Emadi. We have a question here which I think is really interesting, and I'd like to hear everybody's thoughts on it. But perhaps we'll start with you, which is the question from an audience member is, why is it that people seldom associate water consumption with agriculture, that it's almost invisible? We see water being wasted, quote, quote, or used in all other manner, and we want to control its usage, but somehow the food that's in our water is forgotten. And so what can be done to kind of raise awareness in this so that people are more aware of how much water goes into the production of their food, and perhaps are a little more conscientious in how they approach their food and its wastage?
Actually, the issue is much more cultural and related to the society. I think traditionally, Middle East and Near East and North Africa, we always have been in a dried and semi-dried area. And this is part of our culture. I can tell about the central part of Iran, which the water is a holy product. It's not just water, H2O. Therefore, the value among the people is completely different. The attitudes of the people toward the water is different. Now, for example, we call the name of village is Abadi, means coming from Ab. The place that Ab is there is developed. And Biaban means the place that there is no any water. Biaban, the desert. You know, Ab and water is a significant cultural meaningful issue for the people for a long, long time. But unfortunately, during recent times and urbanization and modern life, the connection between people and the nature have been cut, particularly new generation. And when this sort of organic, philosophical or attitude type of relationship have been cut, the people look at the food as a product, as you mentioned, as a sort of products that make just him full of energy, nothing more than that. That's why this is a much more cultural things and so on and so forth, and I think that needs to be actually in the part of the education system, particularly for the new generation. But coming back to the issue in the global level and regional level, I really do believe that we need in our region a regional food sovereignty strategy. Why? Because we have diverse countries. From the monarchy that you mentioned, from the country which buy the food security and the country which focus on the self-sufficiency and the natural resources are different. And as Ali mentioned, we have a very valuable, diverse genotype and type of area in the Near East and in the GCC countries. And when you have a variety, when you have diversity, this is a source, this is a wealth for cooperation. That's why I'm thinking with this diversity, the regional sort of cooperation among the countries, although it seems to be politically very far, but I think the pressure, the whole sort of tragedy make a sort of type of change for the people to think about a new way of thinking. That's why I'm thinking with such a diverse situation that we have in the region, there is a seed and the capital for cooperation. And this cooperation can work in two manners. One, of course, is a cooperation among the countries. And the second, of course, is innovation. And cooperation in innovation and innovation in cooperation. That's very important. We need to actually think about, and when I talk about innovation, innovation, of course, it means not only technology, just hard part of hard type of technology, but also software in terms of way of thinking, in terms of conceptualization, in terms of way of looking non-linear and multiple and transdisciplinary way of thinking about the cooperation among the members countries in the region. And in terms of innovation, of course, as my colleagues mentioned, we need to think about the food sovereignty in the new ways of thinking and based on sovereignty of the nations. And in terms of innovation, of course, there are, as Ali mentioned, there are lots of potential in the region. In terms of water harvesting, in terms of plant diversity, and a new technology. And the new technology can be divided in two parts. One, digital technology, which I'm actually working on that in China for the last 10 years, and I can see that a huge amount of change is happening in China just by digital technology among small, medium farmers for food sovereignty, food security, in terms of enhancement of the production, by the communication, by new technology, by access to the knowledge, access to the techniques, seeds, money, sources, and so on and so forth. And of course, biotechnology, which is a wide range of options, and the new farming system. In our region, we cannot just rely on new just water system and drip irrigation and so on. We need to shift to the shelter agriculture. Our main problem is not just irrigation, is evaporation, and the amount of evaporation because of the global warming is going so high in the very near future That's why we need to shift to the shelter agriculture, protected agriculture, not only glass house, not only warm house, but also cool house, the whole wide range of options that we can produce plants under the sheltered and protected sort of environment, which reduce the amount of evaporation, aspiration, the sort of any kind of danger that will, and sort of all problem that may cause the plants. That's why I think if we use new innovation with a wide range of technologies and plant production and all type of new techniques with the cooperation among the members countries, particularly with the neighboring countries, regional countries, and through the third-party countries. There is an option that now China is working with Arab countries and Iran for actually bringing down the water consumption and the drought and all these things. That's why I think this type of cooperation with the third parties, India, China, and so on and so forth, not only the regional countries, that would be a good way of cooperation and innovation in cooperation and cooperation on technology and innovation. And I think this is a very promising sort of outlook for the future for cooperation among the countries and coping with the situation.
If you're trying to remember the importance of agriculture and water consumption, or help your friends remember, 1 kilo of grain more or less takes 1,000 liters of water. And if you're going to produce fed, excuse me, animal products, say 5 times more of the feed conversion. So it's fairly easy to remember. And if we think about how much of what do you drink every day, maybe 1 liter of water, how much you're consuming directly through wheat or rice, maybe 1,000 times as much. Yeah.
Sure. So what about like a kilo of beef?
5 to 10,000 liters of water.
Wow, there you go. Thank you so much. And I'm getting more questions now. Sorry, I'm trying to stay on top of them. Although there's so many things I'm so interested by everything you all said, I could have asked more. Logan, there's one for you that's come from the audience, which is, I think it's referring to Qatar specifically, but it just says, how can the nation adapt its food portfolio to ensure resilience against external political and economic shifts? So obviously, given we had the blockade and other things, it's probably more forward-looking, how to avoid those.
Sure. Well, the food security strategy I mentioned goes until this year, and the ministry is busy looking forward to figure out what's next. We're dealing not only with questions of where do we source our feed for animal, but looking at questions of water inputs. As we heard in earlier sessions, there's different sources of water here, and there's strong regulations on where those sources can be used and where they can't be used, and so on. So some of this is strategizing on what's realistic for production. There's been a lot of it. If you're here, maybe you've attended some of these events, there's been looking at innovations for vertical farming. Is that viable? Which commodities should we do it for? Animal feed? Should we do it for fruits and vegetables? Is it cost competitive with alternatives on the market? And this goes back to the sovereignty question. And this really is a political question. To which products do we as the state of Qatar want to deem critical and essential goods that we're going to subsidize and ensure that they're provided and produced here, and others that we're going to rely on the market. And if that market is disrupted, then we're okay with it being disrupted, and we have other sources, either through the strategic reserve that I mentioned or domestic production. I'm not sure if that answers the person exactly, but
Ali wants to contribute, add to that.
Just to build on this, I think science and innovations can offer a lot to the countries in the region and much more broadly in dealing with the issue of water scarcity, because this is really the discussion and how it's affecting. So in the CGIAR, we've been, for example, plastic houses that are very popular in this region. The challenge is the cooling, not really the water that you use to produce the crop, but the cooling. It takes about 8 times more water to cool down. So we've developed technologies that uses net houses and cooling at the root zone of the plants without actually having to cool the environment. So you're saving 80% of the water, and you're actually multiplying by 4 or 5 the ability for any country in the region to produce food with a fraction of the water. And you're able to do the cooling using small solar panels to cool the water, so you don't really need to consume energy. And we're bringing, through collaboration with MIT from the US, what we call ultra-low pressure emitters that uses only 10% of the energy. So you have saving on the energy, you have saving on the water, and you're increasing your capacity to produce far more crop with a drop of water. In India, for example, to grow lentil, which is a very strategic crop, you know, India, if you don't eat lentil, you have not eaten. 1.3 billion people. So lentil takes usually 90 days. And you need at least one irrigation. It's very drought tolerant. So we've actually managed to reduce the growing period from 90 to 60. And then this enabled that you introduce lentil in between two rice crops that have 80 days in between, using residual moisture, because this is where you need to be able to grow rice. So no added water. And you have a very important strategic crop that improves the nutrition and allow you to deal with the challenge of water scarcity. And again, maybe the final point is the question about the choices of what we eat. You can make everyday decision we make about what we eat affects on how much water we consume. And of course, there is a time lag, because this is eventually would affect the market and create demand on whether plant-based, on animal-based meal. And you know, very eloquently, you mentioned it takes about 7 to 8 times more water if your choices are always animal-based or meat-based diets compared to a plant-based diet. So all of these things will need to come in the education system, in raising awareness, in preparing the children, because you're going to achieve this change over time. You cannot just do it overnight. So I am sure in many of the new curriculums that are being designed, some of these elements are taken into the design of these programs. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And that addresses a question we also just received from the audience, which is specifically on how can we try to change diets and by discussing the impact on water resources. Does anybody else want to address that? Otherwise, I have a question asking about the Grand Renaissance Dam. I don't know, Ali, if there's something you want to talk about, or whether it's something that Mark, I think I want to ask you to address it, Mark. Talking about food security in Egypt, Qatar, and the dam, that's the question. Would you like to take that on?
Sure. You asked a question earlier about zero sum. And I think one of the issues on this dam is, I'm sure most of you are probably aware, but Ethiopia is in the final stages of operationalizing a very large dam on the Nile that Egypt has not been particularly happy about. If you look at this dam as Ethiopia building it to take water so that it can grow crops and that water otherwise would have gone to Egypt, then you're talking about it as a zero-sum competition. If you talk about this dam or any other water infrastructure project as something that's creating benefits from water, so there's some for irrigation, there's some for power, and then you talked about dividing those benefits that are greater than the water itself, then you can switch from thinking about zero sum, it's my water, it's your water, to how can we manage the whole resource well and share the benefits that are greater because we're thinking about it together. Now, whether in this specific circumstance where that goes is one question, but I just would say it as, the way to get out of the zero sum thinking is to think, you don't put water in a box and keep it in your house, you use it for something. So it's to produce some kind of benefit, an environmental benefit, a food benefit, a health benefit. So if you switch, as soon as you go from the benefit from it's water, either mine or yours, to how can we produce something of value, or how do we value it in the broadest sense, you can switch from the zero sum to the positive sum.
Perfect.
Well, okay.
Please, yeah.
If it was easy to answer this question in a 2-minute intervention in a panel, probably there would have not been an issue in the first place. But on a more serious note, I think, in my previous life as Vice President of the African Development Bank, we've worked on what we called a confidence building among the 12 riparian countries to try and get the countries to talk, to identify win-win opportunities to develop water infrastructure along the Nile and find a good way to work together, because every country has the right to develop its own resources and to look after its own people. The question is, sometimes you get bugged in the details. So there are important opportunities. For example, the question of virtual water. Ethiopia has almost more than 200 million heads of cattle. And, of course, these, to sustain themselves, they eat grass, they eat trees, they eat shrubs, and that by itself is a consumption of water. So how can you actually use that for inter-regional trade, and you're actually able to quantify some of those things and then share, these products and be able to quantify how much water is being shared. The question about managing the tripartite agreement between the riparian countries is a very complicated diplomatic issue, and I think the countries themselves would probably be better placed to answer. I can only offer some suggestions on the whole question, but it's a reality, it's there. So the challenge, if I was thinking about it, I would see how you would work with the existing systems in ways that brings in benefit for everyone, because the water is still needed. On a broader comment, when you look at the River Nile as a whole, there's probably 20 to 30 times more water that goes into waste in the form of evapotranspiration in the Great Lakes itself. So instead of being focused on a small portion, no matter how big it is still a very small portion of the total amount of water that goes into waste. But if you do that, then you have the complexity of security, uncharted territories in many of the open forests and shallow waters in Africa. And this is requiring an international effort, much bigger than the riparian countries themselves. They need some of the superpowers, they need maybe institutions like the UN and others to come and start and mobilize a political process backed up by a technical process, some of the big countries, and then eventually you're able to look at opportunities for the betterment of the entire continent, not just the 3 countries that are concerned.
Very well said. Logan, I feel we're talking about Ethiopia. You're dying to pitch in. I can't not ask you to. Quickly, maybe. We have like 1 minute, 2 minutes.
I'm resisting. I think if anyone's Googled me, I've been working in Ethiopia for 2 decades. So there's lots to say on this story. Maybe whoever asked this question, if you want to know more, we can meet later. Otherwise, this may be a long conversation.
Dr. Mati, did you have?
I just actually point out one of the questions which was mentioned about the consumption pattern. I think the international level and global level, the food waste and loss, the water waste and loss actually is a very important issue, particularly in the rapid rate of urbanization. When the rapid rate of urbanization happened, we lost the villagers, which their consumption is low, the production is high, and we transfer them to the urban area with a high consumption, low production. And this is a real big problem, particularly in food waste and loss, which we have about 33% of the total food produced is lost or waste. And these are much more cultural governance and managemental issues in terms of to be technical. And I think this is one of the major issues that we really need to think in the same side that we are looking for water harvesting, food production, availability. We need to think about the food waste and loss and reducing that, which is not a hard, big job. That's why I'm thinking this is a real important thing, particularly in such a country with a long history that appreciate the food, appreciate the mercy of God, appreciate the water and so on. That's another major point in the region and in the Muslim countries and in the area, which I think would need to be considered.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I think that's a great note to end on. We clearly recognize that the nexus between water and food is beyond mere resources. It's got social, political, governance, ramification. We could talk about these issues all day, but we are standing between you and your food. And I don't think a food panel should be doing that. So please join me in thanking our wonderful speakers. Thank you. We're going for lunch. Thank you so much.